Chapter 18 of Sinking of the Titanic, Most Appalling Ocean Horror. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Lasky. Sinking of the Titanic, Most Appalling Ocean Horror by Jay Henry Mowbray. Lady DUFF-GORDON'S Experiences. Says it was as if giant hand had pushed ship down. Realistic picture of Titanic's death plunge. The long dreary wait. Man at wheel tells of crash. Told by phone, quote, iceberg ahead, quote, just as ship struck. Saw captain on bridge. Almost frenzied by the memory of the disaster through which they had passed, many of the survivors were unable for days even to discuss all the details of the Titanic horror. One of the best accounts was given by Lady Duff-Gordon, wife of Sir Cosmo Duff-Gordon, who dictated it. Her tale shows that the Titanic was near icebergs before she went to bed on the night of the disaster. Here is her story, as well as that of others. I was asleep. The night was perfectly clear. We had watched for some time the fields of ice. There was one just before I went below to retire. I noticed among the fields of ice a number of large bergs. There was one which one of the officers pointed out to me. He said it must have been 100 feet high and seemed to be miles long. It was away off in the distance. I went to my bedroom and retired. I was awakened by a long, grinding sort of shock. It was not a tremendous crash, but more as though someone had drawn a giant finger all along the side of the boat. I awakened my husband and told him that I thought we had struck something. There was no excitement that I could hear, but my husband went up on deck. He returned and told me that we had hit some ice, apparently a big berg, but that there seemed to be no danger. We went on deck. No one, apparently, thought there was any danger. We watched a number of women and children and some men going into the lifeboats. At last, one of the officers came to me and said, "Lady Gordon, you had better go in one of the boats." I said to my husband, "Well, we might as well take the boat, although I think it will be only a little pleasure excursion until morning." The boat was the 12th or 13th to be launched. It was the captain's special boat. There was still no excitement. 5 stokers got in, and 2 Americans, A.L. Solomon of New York and L. Stengel of Newark. Besides these, there were 2 of the crew, Sir Cosmo, myself, and a Miss Frank, an English girl. There were a number of other passengers, mostly men, standing nearby, and they joked with us because we were going out on the ocean. Quote, "The ship can't sink," quote, said one of them. "You will get your death of cold out there in the ice." Cruised among ice for 2 hours. We were slung off, and the stokers began to row us away. We cruised around among the ice for 2 hours. Sir Cosmo had looked at his watch when we went off. It was exactly 12:15 a.m., and I should think 15 minutes after the boat struck. It did not seem to be very cold. There was no excitement aboard the Titanic. Suddenly, I had seen the Titanic give a curious shiver. The night was perfectly clear. There was no fog, and I think we were 1,000 feet away. Everything could be clearly seen. There were no lights on the boats except a few lanterns which had been lighted by those on board. Almost immediately after the boat gave this shiver, we heard several pistol shots, and a great screaming arose from the decks. Then the boat's stern lifted in the air, and there was a tremendous explosion. Then the Titanic dropped back again. The awful screaming continued. 10 minutes after this, there was another explosion. The whole forward part of the great liner dropped down under the waves. The stern rose 100 feet, almost perpendicularly. The boat stood up like an enormous black finger against the sky. The screaming was agonizing. I never heard such a continued chorus of utter despair and agony. Then there was another great explosion, and the great stern of the Titanic sank as though a great hand was pushing it gently down under the waves. As it went, the screaming of the poor souls left on board seemed to grow louder. It took the Titanic but a short time to sink after that last explosion. It went down slowly without a ripple. We had heard the danger of suction when one of these great liners sink. There was no such thing about the sinking of the Titanic. The amazing part of it all to me as I sat there in the boat looking at this monster being was that it all could be accomplished so gently. Then began the real agonies of the night. Up to that time, no one in our boat, and I imagine no one in any of the other boats, had really thought that the Titanic was going to sink. For a moment, a silence seemed to hang over everything, and then, from the water about where the Titanic had been, arose a bedlam of shrieks and cries. There were women and men clinging to the bits of wreckage in the icy water. An awful chorus of shrieks. It was at least an hour before the last shrieks died out. I remember next, the very last cry was that of a man who had been calling loudly, "My God! My God!" He cried monotonously, in a dull, hopeless way. For an entire hour there had been an awful chorus of shrieks, gradually dying into a hopeless moan, until this last cry that I spoke of. Then all was silent. When the awful silence came, we waited gloomily in the boats throughout the rest of the night. At last morning came. On one side of us was the ice floes and the big bergs, and on the other side we were horrified to see a school of tremendous whales. Then, as the mist lifted, we caught sight of the Carpathia looming up in the distance and headed straight for us. We were too numbed by the cold and horror of that awful night to cheer or even utter a sound. We just gazed at one another and remained speechless. Indeed, there seemed to be no one among us who cared much what happened. Those in the other boats seemed to have suffered more than we had. We, it seemed, had been miraculously lucky. In one of the boats was a woman whose clothing was frozen to her body. The men on the Carpathia had to chop it off before she could be taken to a warm room. Several of the stokers and sailors who had manned the boats had been frozen to death, and they lay stiff and lifeless in the bottom of the boats, while the women and children were lifted to the Carpathia. I did not see Captain Smith after I was pulled into the small boat, but others told me that when the Titanic went down, Captain Smith was seen swimming in the icy water. He picked up a baby that was floating on a mass of wreckage and swam with it to one of the small boats. He lifted the baby into the boat, but the child was dead. The women in the boat, according to the story told me, wanted the captain to get into the boat with them, but he refused, saying, "No, there is a big piece of wreckage over here, and I shall stick to that. We are bound to be rescued soon." Nothing more was seen of Captain Smith. 15 brides lose their husbands. There was an absolute calm and silence on the Carpathia. There were hundreds of women who had lost their husbands, and among them 15 brides. Few of these had been married more than 5 or 6 months. No one cared to talk. The gloom was awful. I buried myself in my cabin and did not come on deck again. From Robert Hitchens, quartermaster at the wheel of the Titanic when the great vessel crashed into the iceberg, and then in command of one of the boats which left the steamship before it went down, have come details of the terrible sight at sea which could have been known to perhaps no other person. And standing out in memory of this young Cornishman are shrieks and groans that went up from the dark hulk of the giant steamship before she sank. Hitchens, a type of young Englishman who follows the sea, had for years been on the troop ship Dongola, running to Bombay, and thought himself fortunate when he obtained his berth as quartermaster of the Titanic, the greatest and largest of all steamships. He told in their sequence the events of the night and morning of April 14th and 15th. It was in his boat that Mrs. John Jacob Astor took her place, after Colonel Astor had kissed her good-bye and handed her a flask of brandy, then taking his place in the line of men, some of whom realized even then that the steamship was doomed. And his last sight as his boat was lowered was of Captain Smith, standing on the bridge, giving his orders as calmly as if he were directing her entrance into a harbor. He told of how the officers stood with revolvers drawn to enforce, if the emergency should arise, that rule of the sea of women first. But the emergency did not arise, and the men stood back or helped the women to their seats. A seaman's narrative. In the way of a seaman, he told the narrative of the night spent in the little boat, comforting as best he could the women who did not realize as he did that some of them had looked upon their loved ones for the last time. My watch was from 8 to 12 o'clock, said Hitchens. From 8 to 10 o'clock I was the standby man, and from 10 to 11 o'clock I had the wheel. When I was at the standby, it was very dark, and, while it was not dark, there was a haze. I cannot say about the weather conditions after 10 o'clock, for I went into the wheelhouse, which is enclosed. The second officer was the junior watch officer from 8 to 10 o'clock, and at 8 o'clock he sent me to the carpenter with orders for him to look after the fresh water, as it was going to freeze. The thermometer then read 31.5 degrees, but so far as could be seen, there was no ice in sight. The next order was from the second officer for the deck engineer to turn the steam on in the wheelhouse, as it was getting much colder. Then the second officer, Mr. Lotheller, told me to telephone the lookout in the crow's nest. "Tell them," he said, "to keep a sharp and strict lookout for small ice until daylight, and to pass the word along to the other lookout men." I took the wheel at 10 o'clock, and Mr. Murdoch, the first officer, took the watch. It was 20 minutes to 12, and I was steering, when there were 3 gongs from the lookout, which indicated that some object was ahead. Almost instantly, it could not have been more than 4 or 5 seconds, when the lookout men called down on the telephone, "Iceberg ahead!" Hardly had the words come to me when there was a crash. I ain't likely to forget, sir, how the crash came. There was a light grating on the port bow, then a heavy crash on the port bow, then a heavy crash on the starboard side. I could hear the engines stop and the lever closing the watertight emergency doors. Titanic settles in the water. Mr. Murdoch was the senior officer of the watch, and with him on the bridge were Mr. Buxtall, the 4th officer, and Mr. Moody, the 6th officer. The Titanic listed, perhaps 5 degrees to the starboard, and then began to settle in the water. I stood at attention at the wheel from the time of the crash until 20 minutes after 12, and had no chance to see what the captain did. Mrs. Potter, Mrs. Earnshaw, and Mrs. Stevenson had spoken freely of the accident to the conductor of the train which took them home. Quote, From the descriptions of the scene that followed the accident given to me by the three ladies, said the conductor, it seems utterly impossible to tell adequately of the suffering and hardship brought about by the catastrophe. It all happened so suddenly, without a moment to make the least preparation. Most of the passengers had gone to bed. The day had been clear, and nearly everybody spent the afternoon and evening on the decks, and between 10 and 10:30 o'clock, the steamer chairs, smoking rooms, and cafes were gradually vacated. The sea was perfectly calm, and least expected was the crash, which was the sounding note of the Titanic's doom. Quote, "I was in the first lifeboat that was lowered," Mrs. Potter told me. The jar, which tumbled nearly everyone from his berth, was followed by a wild scramble to the decks. Women in nightclothes, over which were thrown coats, ran distractedly in all directions. Men, almost crazed with excitement, tore madly about trying to gather together families and relatives, and the confusion was increased by the orders shouted by the ship's officers to the crew to make ready the lifeboats. Colonel and Mrs. John Jacob Astor were standing near me when I got into the boat. They did not attempt to leave the ship, and the last time I saw them together was when they, embracing each other, watched the first boat lowered. I was placed in the boat with Mrs. Thayer. From the boat, we could see Jack Thayer jump from the ship. His mother saw him struggling in the water. We cried to him to swim to our boat. He tried twice to get into a lifeboat near him, and both times he was pushed away by persons in it. We saw him swim to an ice cake on which were 30 men. Only 10 of them were saved. Suffered from exposure. In our boat were about 20 persons, most of them women, who suffered intensely from the exposure. Their scanty clothes were no protection from the water and ice. Mrs. Thayer rowed us for more than 2 hours. She battled with the waves which threatened to overturn us, and worked as valiantly as any experienced seaman could have done. To her, for the most part, we owe our lives. We did not meet with Mrs. Thayer's son until he had been on the Carpathia for 24 hours. He had been picked up from a raft and placed in the ship's hospital. As soon as he was able to get about, he ran hurriedly through the Carpathia, and there was a happy meeting when he there saw his mother. While the accommodations on the Carpathia were not very comfortable, the passengers of the Titanic who were rescued by that vessel were well treated and feel grateful to the officers and passengers. The 8 musicians who went down in the Titanic and who were playing "Nearer, My God, to Thee" when all the boats had gone, were under the leadership of Bandmaster Hartley, who was transferred from the Mauretania to take up his duties on the largest steamer of the White Star Line. Under his direction were John Hume, violinist, Herbert Taylor, pianist, Fred Clark, bass viol, George Woodward, cellist, and Messrs. Brayley, Crins, and Bressot, who played when the others were off duty. On the Celtic were John S. Carr and Lewis Cross, cellist and bass viol of the orchestra on that steamship. When they got shore leave, they told something about the men on the Titanic, with whom they had many voyages. They also were acquainted with the conditions under which the men lived on the Titanic, and gave a graphic idea of the manner in which they must have responded when the call of duty came. A man with a high sense of duty. Some were already in bed, and some were probably smoking when the ship hit the iceberg, said John S. Carr. The Titanic had a special lounging and smoking room, with the sleeping rooms opening off it. It was so late that they all must have been there when the first shock came. Bandmaster Hartley was a man with the highest sort of a sense of duty. I don't suppose he waited to be sent for, but after finding how dangerous the situation was, he probably called his men together and began playing. I know that he often said that music was a bigger weapon for stopping disorder than anything on earth. He knew the value of the weapon he had, and I think he proved his point. The thing that hits me hardest, said Louis Cross, is the loss of happy Jock Hume, who was one of the violinists. Hume was the life of every ship he ever played on, and was beloved by every one from cabin boys to captains on the White Star Line. He was a young Scotchman, not over 21, and came of a musical family. His father and his grandfather before him had been violinists and makers of musical instruments. The name is well known in Scotland because of it. His real first name was John, but the Scotch nickname stuck to him, and it was as Jock Hume that he was known to everyone on the White Star Line, even when he sailed as bandmaster. Over in Dumfries, Scotland, I happen to know there's a sweet young girl hoping against hope. Jock was to have been married the next time that he made the trip across the ocean. He was a young man of exceptional musical ability. If he had lived, I believe he would not long have remained a member of a ship's orchestra. He studied a great deal, although he could pick up without trouble difficult composition which would have taken others long to learn. The odd part of it is that Jock Hume's mother had a premonition that something would happen to him on this trip. He was on the sister ship Olympic a few months ago when, on her maiden voyage, she collided with the warship Hawk. There was a rent torn in the side of the Olympic at that time, and she had to be towed back to Belfast. A mother's fateful dream. Young Hume went back to his home in Dumfries to spend the time until she should be repaired, and when his mother heard of the accident, she begged him not to go back to life on the sea. He told numbers of persons in Liverpool about it. Mrs. Hume had a dream of some sort, and said she was sure no good would come of it if he went back. Jock had his eye on going in for concert music sooner or later, but he laughed at his mother's fears and took the chance to go on the Titanic. He was known on many ships and had friends in New York. Last winter, he got to know Americans who were wintering at the Constant Springs Hotel in Kingston, Jamaica. He had been bandmaster on the Carmania of the Cunard Line, and had played with the orchestra of the Majestic, the California of the Anchor Line, and the Megantic of the White Star Company, which plies between Liverpool and Montreal. Hume was a light-hearted, fine-tempered young fellow with curly blonde hair, a light complexion, and a pleasant smile. He was the life of every ship he ever sailed on, and was full of fun. He is mourned by every man who knew him. Another thing of which we are all talking is that Fred Clark, the bass viol of the Titanic, should have gone down on his first trip across the Atlantic. Clark was well known in concert in Scotland, and had never shipped before. The White Star people were particularly anxious to have good music on the first trip of the Titanic, and offered him good pay to make just one trip. As the winter concert season had closed, he finally accepted. He was 34 years of age and was not married, but had a widowed mother. He was a well-set-up man of a little over medium height, with black hair, dark complexion, and a high forehead. Clark was jolly company and of optimistic temperament. Just before he sailed, a number of persons were joking with him about his finally going to sea, and he said, "Well, you know, it would be just my luck to go down with the ship. I've been kept away from it so long it might finish me on this trip." Then he laughed cheerily, and all his friends joined in. They all considered the Titanic as safe as a hotel. The boat's musicians. Herbert Taylor, the pianist, was considered a master of his instrument. He was a man of an intellectual turn of mind, with a thin, studious face. He was married, and his home was in London. About Woodward, the cello, I can tell you but little. His home was in Leeds. The other three men, Brayley, Crins, and Bressot, made up the trio which played the second cabin and in the restaurant. They had been playing together for some time, but neither Carr nor myself shipped with them on any voyage. It's a mistake from the technical point of view to call a steamer's orchestra a band, said Carr. The term is a survival of the days when they really had a brass band on board. On all the big steamships, now the music is given by men who are thorough masters of their instruments. The Titanic orchestra was considered one of the finest which was ever boated when the ship put out from the other side, and I think the way the men finished up showed that they had about as good stuff inside as any who went down in the Atlantic. H.E. Stephenson of New York, another survivor who leaped into the sea and was picked up, declared that he saw the iceberg before the collision. Quote, "It seemed to me that the berg, a mile away, I should say, was about 80 feet out of the water. The ice that showed clear of the water was not what we struck. After the collision, I saw ice all over the sea. When we hit the berg, we seemed to slide up on it. I could feel the boat jumping and pounding, and I realized that we were on the ice, but I thought we would weather it. I saw the captain only once after the collision. He was telling the men to get the women and children into the boats. I thought then that it was only for precaution, and it was long after the boats had left that I felt the steamer sinking. I waited on the upper deck until about 2 o'clock. I took a look below and saw that the Titanic was doomed. Then I jumped into the ocean, and within 5 minutes I was picked up." Discipline described as perfect. Stephenson also described the discipline upon the boat as perfect. Many women, as well as men, he said, declined to leave the Titanic, believing she was safe. Miss Cornelia Andrews of Hudson, New York, was one of the first to be put into a lifeboat. "I saw the Titanic sink," she said. "I saw her blow up. Our little boat was a mile away when the end came, but the night was clear and the ship loomed up plainly, even at that distance. As our boat put off, I saw Mr. and Mrs. Astor standing on the deck. As we pulled away, they waved their hands and smiled at us. We were in the open boat for about 4 hours before we were picked up." E.W. Beans, a second cabin passenger, was picked up after swimming in the icy water for 20 minutes. He too jumped into the sea after the boats were lowered. "I heard a shot fired," said Beans, "just before I jumped. Afterward, I was told a steerage passenger had been shot while trying to leap into a lifeboat filled with women and children." How the wireless operator on the Carpathia, by putting in an extra 10 minutes on duty, was a means of saving 745 lives, was told by Dr. J. F. Kemp, the Carpathia's physician. "Our wireless operator," said Dr. Kemp, "was about to retire Sunday night when he said jokingly, 'I guess I'll wait just 10 minutes, then turn in.' It was in the next 10 minutes that the Titanic's call for help came. Had the wireless man not waited, there would have been no survivors. The iceberg that sank the Titanic looked to be as big as the Rock of Gibraltar," said Thomas Brown, one of the stewards of the Carpathia, in describing what he saw when the crew of his ship picked up the survivors from the Titanic. Brown left the Carpathia a few minutes after she was docked, and he gave a vivid description of the work of the rescue. There were 2,341 persons aboard the Titanic, counting officers and crew, said the steward. 710 persons were saved, so the list of those who drowned numbers 1,631 persons. A clear SOS signal. I had turned in for the night when Maine, our wireless operator, caught the SOS signal of distress. He told me it was the clearest signal of any sort he ever received. The minute he got the message, he hastened to Captain Rostrom and said, "Captain, the Titanic is sinking. She struck an iceberg." Captain Rostrom did not believe it. "Here it comes again, Captain," said the operator. That was all the captain needed to get our crew into action. He sounded the bell for the watchman and sent him to order all hands on deck. I doubt if any passengers on the Carpathia knew of the tragedy until Jones, the first mate, sounded the emergency gong after the watchman had summoned the crew. A few minutes after we got the signal for help, we were ready for action. The SOS reached us shortly after midnight. We were then 56 miles away from the Titanic. Our engineer turned about and put on full speed, and we reached the Titanic about 3:30 o'clock Monday morning. While the Carpathia was speeding towards the doomed ship, Captain Rostrom summoned the higher officers together and said he would hold every man responsible for the work assigned to him. He told Maine to answer the Titanic and tell Captain Smith that we were making for his ship, full steam ahead. Phillips, the operators of the Titanic, evidently did not get our reply, or if he did receive it, he could not answer us in any way. Captain Rostrom told Mrs. Smith, the stewardess, to prepare for any emergency. He told me to get coffee, sandwiches, and other food ready for the survivors. On our way to the Titanic, the captain went below and told the engineer that he must get to the Titanic before she sank. I doubt if Captain Rostrom ever got as much speed out of the Carpathia as he did on the way to the Titanic. Long before the Carpathia got near the scene of the wreck, our boats were ready to be lowered into the water. Promptness in handling lifeboats. 2 men were stationed at each boat, and I and Thomas McKenna, seamen, were in charge of boat number 1. We have 16 boats on the ship, and they were hanging suspended from the davits within 15 minutes after we received the SOS call for help. I must not forget the women who were on the Carpathia. They were the most self-sacrificing women I ever saw. Their fortitude under the distressing circumstances was so remarkable that each one ought to be rewarded for the work she did after the survivors were lifted aboard the Carpathia. As we got near the scene of the wreck, the barometer dropped considerably. It became cold, bitter cold. We did not see the icebergs then, but Captain Rostrom said that we were nearing them. Suddenly, as the iceberg loomed up ahead of our ship, Captain Rostrom ran to the pilot-house and took charge of the helm. The night was clear and starlight, but we did not see an iceberg until the Carpathia was within a half-mile of it. Of course, we had ample time to steer clear of the floes. At 3:30 o'clock, our vessel plunged into a sea of open ice. I believe there must have been 30 or 40 icebergs in the water around the Carpathia. Captain Rostrom took his ship safely through the floe, and suddenly we heard a shriek. It was faint at first, and then it became louder. "The women and children, get them first," Captain Rostrom shouted to the crew on the boat deck, who were waiting the signal to cut loose lifeboats. Our searchlight was trained on the sea ahead, and the boats filled with the shipwrecked passengers stood out in bold relief. I shall never forget the sight. There were many boats from the Titanic loaded with women and children wedged among the ice. Even before we got up to the first boat from the Titanic, we could see the iceberg which sank her. It looked to be as big as the Rock of Gibraltar. It towered high in the air, and it moved very slowly. Avoids crashing into shipwrecked passengers. I believe it was over 500 feet high, and we can judge by its size by recalling that 7/8 of an iceberg is submerged. Within 50 yards of the boats in the water, Captain Rostrum gave the signal to reverse the engines so our ship would not crash into the shipwrecked passengers. "Ready, men, go!" shouted the captain to me, and McKenna loosened the rope and our boat dropped into the water. We tugged away at the oars with all our strength. We shoved our boat alongside of boat number 13 from the Titanic. It was filled with passengers. I believe there were about 15 children in it. Poor little things. Some were benumbed with cold, others were apparently lifeless, and several moaned piteously. The women in the boat were scantily clad. Their clothing was grotesque. They had on wraps, night robes, silk shawls over their heads, and men's coats around them. Many had no shoes, and all of them suffered from the cold. McKenna and I tied a hawser to the boat and then rowed back to the Carpathia. Harris, the boatswain's mate, and another member of the crew helped us to lift the unfortunate ones from the boat. Some had to be carried up the ladder to the boat deck of the Carpathia. A few could walk, but the majority were so benumbed that they could neither speak nor walk. As fast as others of our crew could get the Titanic boats, they were dragged toward the side of the Carpathia. We rescued 20 boatloads of passengers, 710 in all. Our ship resembled a hospital on our way back to New York, for a number of the women and children were ill. The 3 physicians on the Carpathia told me as we were going up the bay that there were 16 patients for the hospital as soon as the Carpathia docked. From a little porthole on the side of the Carpathia, a woman passenger told how the wireless call from the wrecked Titanic sent the Cunard liner racing to the rescue, how the fainting, hysterical survivors were taken from the lifeboats, and of the nerve-wracking scenes that followed on board the rescue ship. A narrative on the tugboat Reynolds. The narrative was told to persons on the tugboat Reynolds as the latter sped side by side with the Carpathia as she moved up the North River to her berth at the Cunard Pier. The woman thrust her head through the porthole of the liner in response to megaphone calls shouted from the Reynolds. "What's the trouble now?" she asked. "Tell us about the wreck of the Titanic. Who are you?" "Miss Peterson of Passaic, New Jersey," was the answer. She was a passenger on the Carpathia. The captain of the Reynolds, William Bennett, turned his craft closer to the Carpathia so those on the tug could get within speaking distance. "It's almost too horrible to speak about," began Miss Peterson. "It seems like a dream. I was asleep in my berth. I had walked along the promenade deck until about 10 o'clock and had gone to my room and fallen asleep. Suddenly, I heard a deep blast from the horns. I awoke startled. Then came another blast. The lights were turned on all over the ship. I heard the officers and crew running up and down the decks. I dressed hurriedly, thinking something was wrong on the Carpathia. I hastened to the deck. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and the stars were shining brightly overhead. I met Captain Rostrum and asked what was the trouble. "The Titanic has struck an iceberg and is sinking." "Great God, men," he shouted, turning to his officers. "Get ready to save these poor souls. There must be 2,500 on board." Before the captain had told us of the wreck, the Carpathia was being turned around toward the Titanic. I went on the boat deck and met many of our passengers. I heard the wireless buzz, and I knew the operator was trying to talk to the Titanic. I tried to get below to see the wireless instrument and operator, but I was told to go on deck again. The operator was clad only in his trousers and undershirt. Captain Rostrum said, "Can't you get her?" "No," replied the operator. "She doesn't answer." "She's going down," said Captain Rostrum, and he ordered the engineer to put on full speed. Speeded faster than usual. I don't know how fast we went, but the speed of the Carpathia at that time was greater by far than the way we had been traveling on our way across the ocean. You can imagine the excitement aboard the Carpathia. Everyone was dressed and on deck before we got to the Titanic, or rather, what was left of her. I guess it was about 3:30 o'clock when we got near the boats of the Titanic. The Carpathia had all her boats hanging on the davits, and Captain Rostrum was ready. I heard women scream as the Carpathia approached the Titanic's boats. I shrieked with them because everyone was saying, "Oh, oh, it's awful, awful." I saw the first boat of the Titanic taken from the water. I saw the icebergs all around the boats. I wonder now how they kept afloat. Before the Carpathia had slackened speed much, a lifeboat from our ship was in the water, and the men were pushing toward the other boats. They tied a rope to the Titanic's boats, and then moved back to the Carpathia, and the first boatload of survivors were taken from the water only a few minutes after we saw it. There were about 50 women and children in it. Some had fainted and lay motionless. Others were screaming and were hysterical. There were no men in the boat, and none of the survivors were dressed properly. They had on night robes, furs, evening gowns, anything they could find. Some were almost frozen. A little girl, they called her Emily, was shrieking, "Oh, Mama, Mama, I'm sick. Oh, Mama, Mama." Her mother could not comfort her because she collapsed as soon as she was lifted to the deck of the Carpathia. All the women on our boat got their heavy clothing and threw it around the survivors. Captain Rostrum told us to take them to our staterooms, and we did all we could to make them comfortable. Nearly all boats taken from water. I did not go on deck again until an hour or more had passed. By that time, the crew of the Carpathia had taken nearly all the boats from the water. I saw 3 loads of passengers taken from the boats, and the mate of the Carpathia said there were about 800 saved. Captain Rostrum had tears in his eyes while he was directing the work of rescue. We were here, there, everywhere it seemed all at once. We got a few men aboard, but they were not taken from the lifeboats. It was women and children first. Our ship was a hospital ship on April 15th. All the women on our boat offered to give up their staterooms, and the captain ordered many of the survivors placed in our berths. The doctors had more than they could do to care for the sick. Women fainted one after the other. Mrs. Astor was unconscious at times. She called for her husband time and again, and so we dared not tell her that Colonel Astor was not aboard. A steward from the Carpathia told the following tale of the rescue of the Titanic's passengers and crew to a group of his mates. It was between 1:15 and 1:30 o'clock, ship's time, Monday morning, he said, when all the stewards were mustered and Chief Steward Hayes told us that a wireless had just come in that the Titanic had hit an iceberg and probably would need help. He urged us to turn right in and get ready for a ship's load of people. The Carpathia turned in the direction the wireless had called from. We got hot coffee ready and laid out blankets and made sandwiches and everything like that. It seemed as if every passenger on the boat knew about the trouble and turned out. Captain Rostrum had shut off the hot water all over the ship and turned every ounce of heat into steam, and the old boat was as excited as any of us. After we got things ready, we went out on deck. It was a glorious morning, no swell in the sea, but bitter cold. The ship's lights were on full blaze, and we were there in the middle of a sea of ice, the finest sight I ever saw. Comparatively empty boat without women. Just as it was about half day and dark, we came upon a boat. There were 18 men in it, and it was in charge of an officer. There were no women in the boat, and it was not more than 1/3 filled. All of the men were able to come up the Jacob's ladder on the Carpathia, which we threw over the port side. Every one of them was given some brandy or hot black coffee. After they were all on board, we pulled up their boat. It was bright morning by now, and all around the Carpathia, here and there, about a 1/4 mile apart, were more boats. These were fuller than the first, and there were women in all of them. The women were hoisted up in bosun's chairs, and the men who could do so climbed the Jacob's ladder. Some of the men, however, had to be hauled up, especially the firemen. There was a whole batch of firemen saved. They were nearly naked. They had jumped overboard and swam after the boats, it turned out, and they were almost frozen stiff. The women were dressed, and the funny thing about it is only 5 of them had to be taken to the hospital. Both the men's hospitals were filled, 24 beds in all. We got 12 boatloads, I think, inside of a little more than an hour. Then, between 1/4 after and half after 8 o'clock, we got the last 2 boats, crowded to the guards and almost all women. After we got the last boatload aboard, the Californian came alongside, and the captains arranged that we should make straight for New York, and the Californian would look around for more boats. We circled round and round, though, and we saw all kinds of wreckage. There was not a person on a stick of it, and we did not get sight of another soul. While we were pulling in, the boatloads of women we saved were quiet enough and not making any trouble at all. But when it seemed sure we would not find any more persons alive, then Bedlam came. I hope I never go through it again. The way those women took on for the folks they had lost was awful, and we could not do anything to quiet them until they cried themselves out. There were 5 Chinamen in the boats, and not a soul knew where they came from. No one saw them get into the boats, but there they were, wherever they came from. The fellows from the crew of the Titanic told us that lots more of them could have got away, only no one would believe that their ship could sink. End of chapter 18.
Chapter 19 of Sinking of the Titanic, Most Appalling Ocean Horror. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Sinking of the Titanic, Most Appalling Ocean Horror by Jay Henry Mowbray. Senators hear startling stories. Managing Director of the White Star Line, J. Bruce Ismay, Captain Rostrum of the Carpathia, Guglielmo Marconi, inventor of the wireless, the second officer of the Titanic, and others, testified before the Senate committee which was investigating the disaster that caused the loss of more than 1,600 lives when the Titanic hit an iceberg. Mr. Ismay was visibly nervous when he took the stand to testify in the Waldorf Astoria, where the hearings were being held. Several times he avoided direct answers by saying, "I know nothing about it." Little, if any, light was thrown on the sea tragedy by his testimony. That the Titanic's rate of speed was approximately 26.5 land miles was brought out from his lips. He was not sure in just what boat he left the Titanic, nor was he sure how long he remained on the liner after she struck. He added, however, that before he entered a lifeboat, he had been told that there were no more women on the deck, and he denied that there had been any censorship of messages from the Carpathia. The seriousness of the inquiry by the Senate Investigating Committee in the Titanic disaster was disclosed when Senator Smith, of Michigan, the chairman, at first flatly refused to let any of the officers or the 200-odd members of the crew of the sunken steamship get beyond the jurisdiction of the United States government. The men were all to have sailed on the steamer Lapland. Later, it was settled that the greater part of the crew would be permitted to sail on the steamer, but that the 12 men and 4 officers among the survivors now under subpoena, together with Mr. Ismay, would not be allowed to depart. Captain Rostrom told a simple, apparently straightforward story, thrilling from its very simplicity and the sailorman quality of the narrative. He answered questions direct, and gave the first authoritative tale of the hearing of the appeal for help, the rush to aid the sinking liner, and the sighting of the ship's boats, and picking them up, the preparations made, while the Carpathia was being urged along under every ounce of steam its boilers could make, to provide for the reception of the survivors on board. Captain Rostrom denied emphatically there was any intention on his part to disregard the inquiry made by the President of the United States, or that any censorship was exercised over wireless messages by any person other than himself. Charles W. Lightholder, second officer of the Titanic, and senior surviving officer of the ship, told of what preceded the sinking of the Titanic, what happened while women were taken away in boats, as brave men stood by, and what happened when the Titanic took her last dip. It was a story of heroism, told quietly and calmly. Lightholder said that tests of the water had been made for ice. It was part of the routine. Water was taken from the side of the ship in canvas buckets, and the temperature learned by putting a thermometer in it. As the second officer of the ship, Lightholder said he had been in charge of it on Sunday when the Titanic struck, from 6 o'clock in the evening until 10, or inside of 2 hours before the collision. He would not admit that the tests were being made solely for the purpose of searching for information as to icebergs. It was part of the routine of the ship. The tests were made for routing purposes and other purposes. The water was not much above freezing. The witness said that he did not know what the tests of the water that day showed. No reports had been made to him. He did not think it necessary that night, when he was on the bridge in charge, to make tests for the purpose of finding out if the Titanic was in the vicinity of icebergs. Did you know that the America had reported to the Titanic the location of icebergs in that neighborhood? Asked Senator Smith. I heard of the message, but I didn't know that it was the America. Did you get from Captain Smith that night any information about the icebergs? No, not that night, said Lightholder. I think it was in the afternoon, about 1 o'clock. I was on the bridge, having relieved First Officer Murdoch, who had gone to lunch. Captain Smith, he said, told him of the wireless message from the America about the icebergs. Lightholder said he couldn't recall just what position the ship was in then, but he could work it out on the chart. When Chief Officer Murdoch returned to the bridge, Lightholder said, he told him exactly the information Captain Smith had communicated to him. What did Murdoch say? Asked Senator Smith. All right, replied Lightholder. So the chief officer of the ship was fully advised by you that you were in proximity to icebergs? He was asked. Yes, sir. How fast was the boat going at that time? Between 21½ and 22 knots. Was that her maximum speed? So far as we knew, said Lightholder, she could go faster than that, if pushed. We understood that that was not her maximum speed. During your voyage, did you know you were in the vicinity of ice? Senator Smith asked. I knew some had been reported. He said the ship was not in proximity to icebergs Saturday or Sunday, although he knew the ship would be near ice on Sunday night. The witness said he knew nothing of the America and the Titanic talking by wireless about icebergs. Senator Smith asked if he sought to send any wireless messages from the Titanic after she struck. He said not. Turning to the subject of lifeboats, Mr. Ismay said he heard the captain give the order to lower the boats. I then left the bridge. 3 boats, he said, he saw lowered and filled. In his own boat were 4 members of the crew and 45 passengers. Was there any jostling or attempt by men to get into the boats? Asked Senator Smith. I saw none. How were the women selected? We picked the women and children as they stood nearest the rail. Representative Hughes handed Senator Smith a note, and then the chairman told Mr. Ismay that it was reported that the second lifeboat left without its full complement of oarsmen, and from 11:30 until 7:30 women were forced to row the boat. I know nothing about it. Representative Hughes's daughter was in this boat and was assigned to watch the cork in the boat and, if it came out, to use her finger as a stopper. Then Senator Smith asked the circumstances under which he left the boat. The boat was being filled, began Mr. Ismay. The officers called out to know if there were any more women to go. There were none. No passengers were on the deck. So, as the boat was being lowered, I got into it. The ship was sinking? Asked Senator Smith. The boat was sinking, almost whispered Mr. Ismay. Was there any attempt to lower the boats of the Carpathia to take on passengers after you went aboard her? Asked Senator Smith. There were no passengers there to take on, said Mr. Ismay. He said he saw no lifeboats in the sea. How many lifeboats were there on the Titanic? 20 altogether, I think, said Mr. Ismay. 16 collapsible and 4 wooden boats. Whether the boats were taken on board the Carpathia or not, he did not know. It has been suggested, Senator Smith continued, that 2 of the lifeboats sank as soon as lowered. Do you know anything about that? I do not. I never heard of it, and I think all the lifeboats were accounted for. When you last saw her, were there indications that the Titanic had broken in two? No, there was no such indication. How long after you left her was it that you looked back for the last time? It may have been 10 minutes or a half hour. I am not sure. Impossible for me to tell. Was there any confusion apparent on the Titanic when you looked back? I didn't see any. All I saw was the green light the last time I looked. After you left Captain Smith on the bridge, did you see him again? I did not. Did you have any message from him? None. How many wireless operators were there on the Titanic? I presume there were 2. One is always on watch. Did they survive? I have been told one did, but I do not know whether it is true or not. Mr. Ismay was asked what he had on when he got into the lifeboat. A pair of slippers, a pair of pajamas, a suit of clothes, and an overcoat. Captain Rostrom of the Carpathia followed Mr. Ismay. He told Mr. Smith that he had been captain of the Carpathia since last January, but that he had been a seaman 27 years. The captain told in detail of the arrangements made to prepare the lifeboats and the ship for the receipt of the survivors. Arriving at the zone of the accident, Captain Rostrom testified he saw an iceberg straight ahead of him and, stopping at 4 a.m., 10 minutes later, he picked up the first lifeboat. The officer sang out he had only one seaman on board and was having difficulty in manning his boat. By the time I got the boat aboard, day was breaking, said the captain. In a radius of 4 miles, I saw all the other lifeboats. On all sides of us were icebergs, some 20, some were 150 to 200 feet high, and numerous small icebergs or growlers. Wreckage was strewn about us. At 8:30, all the Titanic survivors were aboard. Then, with tears filling his eyes, Captain Rostrom said he called the purser. I told him, said Captain Rostrom, I wanted to hold a service of prayer, thanksgiving for the living, and a funeral service for the dead. I went to Mr. Ismay. He told me to take full charge. An Episcopal clergyman was found among the passengers, and he conducted the services. As the prayers were being said, Captain Rostrom testified he was on the bridge searching for survivors. He told of talking with the California, which had arrived. As he searched the sea, one body with a life preserver on floated by. The man was dead, probably a member of the crew, the captain said. The body was not picked up, the officer explaining, because the survivors of the Titanic were in no condition then to see a body brought aboard. But I must say, declared Captain Rostrom with positiveness, every one of the survivors behaved magnificently. They sat in the boats until the order came for them to mount the ladder in turn, and then came up. Asked about the lifeboats, Captain Rostrom said he found one among the wreckage in the sea. Several of the lifeboats brought in on the Carpathia to New York, he said, were lowered last night and hauled away by tenders, he knew not where. Captain Rostrom said that the Carpathia had 20 lifeboats of her own, in accordance with the British regulations. Wouldn't that indicate that the regulations are out of date, your ship being much smaller than the Titanic, which also carried 20 lifeboats? Senator Smith asked. No, the Titanic was supposed to be a lifeboat herself. Captain Rostrom then explained that it was for the good of the shipwrecked people that he brought his ship to New York instead of going to Halifax. At Representative Hughes' suggestion, Captain Rostrom was asked further about the lifeboat with 1 officer and 1 seaman in it. This was the boat from which the representative's daughter was rescued. At least 2 women were rowing in this boat. In another lifeboat he saw women at the oars, but how many he could not tell. In discussing the strength of the Carpathia's wireless, Captain Rostrom said the Carpathia was only 58 miles from the Titanic when the call for help came. Our wireless operator was not on duty, said Captain Rostrom, but as he was undressing, he had his apparatus to his ear. 10 minutes later he would have been in bed, and we never would have heard. Mr. Marconi took the stand as soon as the hearing was resumed for the afternoon. He said he was the chairman of the British Marconi Company. Under instructions of the company, he said operators must take their orders from the captain of the ship on which they are employed. Do the regulations prescribe whether 1 or 2 operators should be aboard the ocean vessels? Yes, on ships like the Titanic and Olympic 2 are carried, said Mr. Marconi. The Carpathia, a smaller boat, carries 1. The Carpathia's wireless apparatus is a short-distance equipment. The maximum efficiency of the Carpathia's wireless, I should say, was 200 miles. The wireless equipment on the Titanic was available 500 miles during the daytime and 1,000 miles at night. Do you consider that the Titanic was equipped with the latest, improved wireless apparatus? Yes, I should say that it had the very best. Charles Herbert Lightholder, second officer of the Titanic, followed Mr. Marconi on the stand. Mr. Lightholder said he understood the maximum speed of the Titanic, as shown by its trial tests, to have been 22.5 to 23 knots. Senator Smith asked if the rule requiring life-saving apparatus to be in each room for each passenger was complied with. Everything was complete, said Lightholder. 16 lifeboats, of which 4 were collapsible, were on the Titanic, he added. During the tests, he said, Captain Clark of the British Board of Trade was aboard the Titanic to inspect its life-saving equipment. How thorough are these captains of the Board of Trade in inspecting ships? Asked Senator Smith. Captain Clark is so thorough that we called him a nuisance. Lightholder said he was in the sea with a life belt on 1 hour and a half. What time did you leave the ship? I didn't leave it. Did it leave you? Yes, sir. Where were you when the Titanic sank? In the officers' quarters. Were all the lifeboats gone then? All but 1. I was about 15 feet from it. It was hanging in the tackle, and they were trying to get it over the bulwarks the last time I saw it. The first officer, Mr. Murdoch, who lost his life, was managing the tackle. The last boat, a flat collapsible, to put off, was the one on top the officers' quarters, Lightholder said. Men jumped upon it on deck and waited for the water to float it off. Once at sea, it upset. The forward funnel fell into the water, just missing the raft and overturning it. The funnel probably killed persons in the water. This was the boat I eventually got on, declared Lightholder. No one was on it when I reached it. Later, about 30 men clambered out of the water onto it. All had on life preservers. Did any passengers get on? Asked Senator Smith. J.B. Thayer, the second Marconi operator, and Colonel Gracie, I recall, said the witness. All the rest were firemen taken out of the water. 2 of these died that night and slipped off into the water. I think the senior Marconi operator did that. Did you see any attempt to get women to go who would not? Yes. Why would they not go? I hadn't time to learn. Did any ask for their family to go? Yes, 1 or 2. Did any families go? No. In the first boat to put off, Lightholder said, He put 20 to 25. 2 seamen were placed in it. The officer said he could spare no more, and that the fact that women rowed did not show the boat was not fully equipped. At that time he did not believe the danger was great. 2 seamen placed in the boat, he said, were selected by him, but he could not recall who they were. The third boat? By the time I came to the third boat, all these on the port side, I began to realize that the situation was serious, and I began to take chances. How long did all the work of loading and lowering a lifeboat take? It was difficult to say, but I think about 15 or 20 minutes. How many passengers did the third boat contain? I filled it up as full as I dared, sir, then lowered it. About 35, I think. The women and children couldn't have stood quieter if they'd been in church. In loading the fourth lifeboat, Lightholder said, he was running short of seamen. I put 2 seamen in, and 1 jumped out. That was the first boat I had to put a man passenger in. He was standing nearby and said he would go if I needed him. I said, "Are you a sailor?" And he replied that he was a yachtsman. Then I told him that if he was a sailor enough to get out over the bulwarks to the lifeboat to go ahead. He did, and proved himself afterward to be a very brave man. Who was he? Did you know him? I didn't know him then, but afterward I looked him up. He was Major Peuchen of Toronto. Had you ever seen him before? Never. Of the fifth boat, Lightholder had no particular recollection. The last boat I put out, my sixth boat, he said, we had difficulty finding women. I called for women, and none were on deck. The men began to get in, and then women appeared. As rapidly as they did, the men passengers got out of the boats again. The boat's deck was only 10 feet from the water when I lowered the sixth boat. When we lowered the first, the distance to the water was 70 feet. All told, Lightholder testified, 210 members of the crew were saved. Lightholder declared he stood on top of the officers' quarters, and as the ship dived, he faced forward and dived also. I was sucked against a blower and held there, testified the officer. Head above water? No, sir. A terrific gust came up the blower. The boilers must have exploded, and I was blown clear. How far were you blown? Barely clear. I was sucked down again, this time on the fiddly grating. Did anyone else have a similar experience? Yes, Colonel Gracie. How did you get loose? I don't know, maybe another explosion. All I know is we came up by a boat. Were there any watertight compartments on that ship? The senator asked. Certainly, 40 or 50. Thomas Cottam, 21 years old, of Liverpool, the Marconi operator on the Carpathia, was the first witness at the evening session. He denied himself some glory by saying he had no stated hours for labor on the Carpathia. Previous witnesses had testified he was not on duty when he received the Titanic's signal for help. He was decidedly uncertain whether he was required to work at night, finally saying it depended on whether he had commercial or ship's business to get off. What were you doing last Sunday evening about 10 o'clock? Asked Senator Smith. Receiving news from Cape Cod, said Cottam. He said he had been sending a lot of messages for the Titanic. Had you closed your station for the night? No. What do you do when you close your station? Switch the storage battery out, said Cottam. Does that prevent receiving or sending messages? The senator continued. No. Does it lessen the likelihood of your getting a signal of any kind? No, not in the least, Cottam replied. You say the Carpathia wireless instruments would send a message about 250 miles with accuracy? Yes, sir. Was there any thunder or lightning Sunday night? No, it was clear. Well, how did you happen to catch the Titanic message of distress? I was looking out for a confirmation by the steamer Parisian of a previous message from the Parisian, a message that came sometime in the afternoon. Did you hear the captain of the Carpathia testify here today? No. He said you were about to retire and caught this Titanic distress message rather providentially? Yes, sir. How far had you got along in your arrangements to retire? Had you taken off your clothes? Yes, my coat. Did you have any instruments then? Yes, the telephones were on my head. I was waiting for the Parisian's answer. I had just called it. How long would you have waited? Several minutes. Would you have retired pretty soon, you think? Yes. Well, when you got the distress message from the Titanic Sunday night, how did you get it? I called the Titanic myself, sir. Who told you to call the Titanic? No one, sir. I did it of my own free will. I asked the Titanic operator if he was aware that Cape Cod had been sending messages for the Titanic. What was the answer? Come at once, was the message, sir, said Cottam. Was that all of it? No, the operator said, I think, come at once, this is a distress message. CQD, Cottam testified. When word of the Titanic's distress was received, Operator Cottam said, he immediately sent them the position of the Carpathia and added that they would hurry to the rescue. Get any reply to that? Asked Senator Smith. Yes, sir, immediately. They acknowledged receipt of it. The witness said the next communication with the Titanic was 4 minutes later, when he confirmed the position of both vessels. At this juncture, the Frankfurt, of the North German Lloyd Line, broke in on the communication, having heard the Titanic's call for help. Later, the steamship Olympic also replied. What did you do then? Asked Senator Smith. I called the attention of the Titanic to the Olympic's efforts to raise it, answered the witness. The Titanic replied it could not hear because of the rush of air and the noise made by the escaping steam. Immediately after telling the Titanic of the Olympic's attempt to get in communication with her, the former, the witness said, sought the Olympic's aid, reporting that it was head down and giving its position. The Baltic broke in at this time, but its efforts to reach the Titanic were without avail. I was in communication with the Titanic at regular intervals until the final message, said Cottam. This was, come quick, our engine room is filling up to the boilers. What was your condition? Asked Senator Smith. I was desperately tired. I was worked out, answered Cottam, who was then excused. The committee adjourned at 10:20 to meet at 10 o'clock the next morning. End of Chapter 19, read by Nancy Cochran Gorgen, Gilbert, Arizona, August 27, 2024.
Chapter 20 of Sinking of the Titanic, Most Appalling Ocean Horror. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Lasky. Sinking of the Titanic, Most Appalling Ocean Horror by Jay Henry Mowbray. Surviving Operators' Experiences. Surviving Operators' Experiences tells Senator how he escaped. Tale of Suffering and Death. Managing Director's Flight Balked. Long Hours and Low Wages for Wireless Men. Refused Help from Frankfurt. Called its operator a fool. Laxity of wireless. Denies sending saved message. Gave warning of ice. With J. Bruce Ismay, Managing Director, and P.A.S. Franklin, General Manager of the White Star Line, Harold Thomas Cottam, Wireless Operator on the Carpathia, Harold Bride, Surviving Operator of the Titanic, the 5 surviving officers from the ill-fated ship and 30 of her seamen in the custody of the Sergeant-at-Arms of the United States Senate, Senator Smith of Michigan and Francis G. Newlands of Nevada, brought their investigation of the greatest sea horror of modern times to a close so far as New York was concerned. When the men of the Titanic, British seamen, had been heard under oath by the committee, they were allowed to return to their homes, where they were subject to the call of their own government. "We must hear the Englishmen first," said Chairman Smith, a few minutes before he and Senator Newlands left shortly after midnight for Washington, "because they need to get back home as soon as possible. We will be able to get the Americans whenever we want them." It had been suggested to Chairman Smith that the British government might offer objections to the keeping of British seamen in this country under the circumstances. "I am proceeding," said Mr. Smith, just as if there was not the slightest possibility of such a protest. Should one come, we will deal with it at that time. The committee had in mind the drafting of important legislation as the result of its hearings. Regulation of the use of the air by wireless operators so as to prevent interference in times of wreck at sea is one law that seemed almost sure to be enacted. Another was legislation requiring not only American, but all foreign vessels using American ports to be equipped with enough lifeboats to take off every passenger and every member of the ship's crew if need be. Patrol of the steamship lanes for icebergs was another. It seemed likewise not at all unlikely that the committee would recommend and Congress enact a law requiring ships, at least those under American registry, to carry 2 operators so that one may be on duty while the other sleeps. The President seemed likely to be asked by a joint resolution of Congress to open negotiations with foreign powers to establish a new and much more southerly steamship lane across the Atlantic by international agreement. Senate to probe false message. It developed that the Senate committee intended to make one of the most important features of its probing work and examination in the false messages that were given out by the White Star Line office in New York on Monday, when it was said that the Titanic had struck an iceberg, but that she was in tow of the Virginian, which was taking her to Halifax, and that all on board were safe. Incident to the sudden close of the hearing was the story of Harold S. Bride, the second and only surviving wireless operator of the Titanic. His tale was one of suffering and of death. He told of the final plunge of the vessel to its ocean burial. Its captain's end also was revealed. He leaped from the bridge when the waters were closing over his ship. In connection with the transfer of the hearing to Washington, it was intimated that the power of the Senate on federal territory would be undisputed in getting at the real facts, and no question of state rights could arise to interfere. Throughout the hearing, also, officials of the White Star Line had portrayed the dangers of sailors' boarding houses in New York as a reason why those detained by the committee should be allowed to sail on the Lapland, which left today. Throughout the hearing, wireless operator Bride, crippled as a result of his experiences and seated in an invalid's chair, told his story of the last moments of the Titanic. His narrative, drawn from him piecemeal by Senator Smith of Michigan, chairman of the committee, held enthralled the committee and the audience. When his ordeal was ended, he was almost on the verge of collapse. The laxity of the wireless. Another phase of the laxity of the wireless, so far as man is concerned, was developed by the chairman. He drew from the witness an acknowledgment that on Sunday evening Bride was sitting, the telephonic apparatus strapped to his ears, adjusting his accounts, while the steamship Californian, seeking to warn the Titanic that icebergs were invading the lanes of ocean travel, called incessantly. Bride said he heard the call, but did not answer because he was busy. It was not until a half-hour later that the Californian, striving to reach the steamship Baltic, reached also the Titanic, whereupon the warning that 3 huge icebergs had been sighted was noted by Bride and verbally communicated to the liner's captain. At this time, however, neither of us worried a bit. When we heard the confusion on deck, I went out to investigate, and when I returned, I found Mr. Phillips sending out a CQD call giving our position. We raised the Frankfurt first, and then the Carpathia, and the Baltic. As I've said, we did not try for the Frankfurt for any length of time, but concentrated our messages on the Carpathia, which had answered that she was rushing to our aid. From time to time, either Mr. Phillips or I would go on deck to observe the situation. The last time I went on deck, I found the passengers running around in confusion, and there was almost a panic. They were seeking lifebelts. All of the large lifeboats were gone, but there was one life raft remaining. It had been lashed on the top of the quarters on the boat deck. A number of men were striving to launch it. I went back to the wireless cabin then. Mr. Phillips was striving to send out a final CQD call. The power was so low that we could not tell exactly whether it was being carried or not, for we were in a closed cabin, and we could not hear the crackle of the wireless at the mast. Both cared for a woman. Phillips kept on sending, however, while I buckled on his lifebelt and put on my own. Then we both cared for a woman who had fainted and who had been brought into our cabin. Then, about 10 minutes before the ship sank, Captain Smith gave word for everyone to look to his own safety. I sprang to the aid of men struggling to launch the life raft, and we had succeeded in getting it to the edge of the boat when a giant wave carried it away. I went with it and found myself underneath. Struggling through an eternity, I finally emerged and was swimming 150 feet from the Titanic when she went down. I felt no suction as the vessel plunged. I did not see Mr. Ismay at all. Captain Smith stuck to the bridge, and, turning, I saw him jump just as the vessel glided into the depths. He had not donned a lifebelt, so far as I could see, and went down with the ship. The witness showed so plainly the mental and physical strain under which he was laboring that both Senators Newlands and Reed urged Senator Smith to excuse him. After a few more interrogations, Senator Smith did so. "I regret extremely having had to subject you to such an ordeal," he said, addressing Bride, "because of your condition. I would have avoided it if possible, but the committee thanks you most heartily for the forbearance you have shown and the frankness of your testimony." Senator Smith then called what he evidently expected to be one of the most important witnesses, Harold S. Bride, the sole surviving wireless operator of the Titanic. Crippled as a result of his experiences, he was wheeled in an invalid's chair to the table where the committee sat. "Contrary to the usual procedure," said Senator Smith, rising in his place, "I must place you under oath. Raise your right hand." Senate repeats the oath. The witness, hand uplifted, listened while the senator repeated the oath. Then he bowed in assent. Bride said he was a native of London, was 22 years old, and had learned his profession in a British school of telegraphy. "What practical experience have you had?" asked Senator Smith. "I have crossed to the States 3 times and to Brazil twice," said Bride. Bride remembered receiving and sending messages relative to the speed of the Titanic on its trial tests. After leaving Southampton on the Titanic's fatal trip, he could not remember receiving or sending any messages for Ismay. Senator Smith asked particularly about messages on Sunday. "I don't remember, sir," said Bride. "There was so much business Sunday." He was asked if Captain Smith received or sent any messages Sunday. "No, sir," was the reply. "How do you know he did not?" "Because I see the messages Mr. Phillips takes when they are made up." "Were those for Sunday made up?" "No, they never were." After testifying he made no permanent record of the iceberg warnings, Bride insisted he gave the memorandum of the warning to the officer on the watch. The name of the officer he could not tell. "I know the officers by sight, but not by name," he said. He did not inform Captain Smith. Bride said he was in bed when the impact came. He was not alarmed at the collision and remained in bed about 10 minutes. He saw Phillips in the operating room. "He told me he thought the boat had been injured in some way and he expected it would have to go back to the builders," said Bride. Better send out a call for assistance. The witness said that, according to arrangement, he relieved Phillips. Immediately the captain came in and said we had better send out a call for assistance, testified Bride. Phillips asked if he wanted to send a distress call. The captain said he did. I could read what Phillips sent, CQD. How soon did he get a reply? As far as I know, immediately. I could not hear what he received, however. The witness told of having intercepted a message from the Californian intended for the Baltic, which told of the presence of 3 huge icebergs in the vicinity of the former vessel. "I gave the message to the captain personally," he said. Bride did not take down the message and could not give its precise form. The Californian was seeking out the Baltic, and I merely noted that it was an ice report and told the captain, he said. Under a fire of questions, Bride acknowledged that a half-hour previously, or at 4:30 Sunday afternoon, he was working on his accounts in the wireless room when he heard the Californian trying to raise the Titanic. He did not respond, he said, because he was busy. "You had the telephone apparatus at your ear," inquired Senator Smith in surprise. Yes, sir. And you did not respond to the call? No, sir. Then a half hour later on, or about 5 hours before the disaster, you took the message when it was intended for another vessel, the Baltic. Yes, sir. In an effort to determine whether the signal CQD might not have been misunderstood by passing ships, Senator Smith called upon Mr. Marconi. Meaning of different calls. The CQ, said Mr. Marconi, is an international signal which means that all stations should cease sending except the one using the call. The D was added to indicate danger. The call, however, now has been superseded by the universal call SOS. Senator Smith then resumed the direct examination of Bride, who has said the North German Lloyd was the first to answer the Titanic's distress signal. Have you heard it said that the Frankfurt was the ship nearest to the Titanic? The senator asked. Yes, sir. Mr. Phillips told me that. How did he know? By the strength of the signals, said the witness, who added that the Carpathia answered shortly after. The witness said that 20 minutes later the Frankfurt operator interrupted to ask what was the matter. What did you reply? The senator inquired. Mr. Phillips said he was a fool and told him to keep out. There was no further effort to get the Frankfurt's position. Time after time, Senator Smith asked in varying forms why the Titanic did not explain in detail its condition to the Frankfurt. Any operator receiving CQD and the position of the ship, if he is on the job, said Bride, would tell the captain at once. Ask him if it would have taken longer to have sent, "You are a fool, keep out," than "We are sinking," suggested Senator Reed. Was your object in dismissing the somewhat tardy inquiry of the Frankfurt due to your desire to hang on to a certainty, the Carpathia? Inquired Senator Smith. The witness said it was. But, under the circumstances, could you not with propriety send a detailed message to the Frankfurt? Senator Smith insisted. I did not think we could under the circumstances. Bride interrogated. Would you still make the same reply if you were told that the Frankfurt was 20 miles nearer to you than the Carpathia? Bride replied that the Carpathia was then on its way with its lifeboats ready. Mr. Marconi testified to the distress signals and said the Frankfurt was equipped with Marconi wireless. He said the receipts of the signal CQD by the Frankfurt's operator should have been all sufficient to send the Frankfurt to the immediate rescue. Under questioning by Senator Smith, Bride said that undoubtedly the Frankfurt received all of the urgent appeals for help sent subsequently to the Carpathia. Why did you not send the messages to the Frankfurt as well as to the Carpathia? Asked Senator Smith. He would not have understood. The witness said that before leaving the cabin, 10 minutes before the ship went down, Phillips sent out a final CQD. There was no response, Bride saying the spark was then so weak that it probably did not carry. When Bride and Phillips stepped out on the beat deck, he said they found persons rushing around in confusion. They were seeking lifebelts. There were no big lifeboats aboard at that time, said Bride. There was a life raft over the officers' quarters, which later was lost over the side. The witness then told of his experience in following with a small boat beneath which he nearly was drowned before he could extricate himself. With a number of other survivors, he clambered on the overturned boat. One of these was Phillips, said the witness. He died on the way to the Carpathia and was buried later at sea. When Bride gained the bottom of the boat, he found between 35 and 40 men already there. The last man aboard. I was the last man invited aboard, said Bride. Did any others seek to get on? Yes, sir, dozens. We couldn't take them. The witness said he did not see J. Bruce Ismay, and that the last he saw of Captain Smith he was in the act of jumping from the bridge just as the ship went down. He said he was swimming within 150 feet of the ship when it went down and that he felt no suction. Long before the hearing was resumed in the afternoon, crowds besieged the Waldorf Astoria rooms, but few who had not been sought by the committee were admitted. C.P. Neal, Commissioner of Labor of the Department of Commerce and Labor, and Representatives Levi and Livingston of New York were among the visitors. Senators Smith and Newlands conferred after luncheon for more than an hour, and it was nearly 4 o'clock when they reached the committee room. "Is Mr. Bride, the operator of the Titanic, here?" Senator Smith asked of Mr. Marconi and Mr. Sammis of the Marconi Company. They told him that Mr. Bride had been sent to a physician, but could be brought back later. The senator said he wanted to ask the operator several additional questions, but could postpone them. The second officer of the Titanic, C.H. Lightoller, was called by Senator Smith, but was not present, and the third officer of the Titanic, Herbert John Pittman, took the stand. "Do you know of your own knowledge whether the Titanic's ship's log was preserved or taken from the Titanic?" asked Senator Smith. "I do not." After the hearing adjourned, Senator Smith made a statement to the press in which he explained the intentions of the committee. He said, "The object of the committee in coming to New York, coincidental with the arrival of the Carpathia, was prompted by the desire to avail itself of first-hand information from the active participants in this sad affair. Our course has been guided solely by this purpose, to obtain accurate information without delay." End of Chapter 20.
Chapter 21 of Sinking of the Titanic, the most appalling ocean horror. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Sinking of the Titanic, Most Appalling Ocean Horror by Jay Henry Mowbray. The Funeral Ship and Its Dead. The cable ship Mackay Bennett, which had been sent out to recover as many as possible of the Titanic's dead, reached her pier in the dockyard at Halifax, Nova Scotia, the nearest port, at 9:30 on the morning of April the 30th, almost exactly 2 weeks after the disaster. Down the gangway to the pier, in the sunlight of a perfect April day, they carried 190 of those who had started forth on the maiden voyage of the biggest ship afloat. In her quest, the Mackay Bennett had found 306 of the Titanic's dead, but only 190 were brought to shore. The rest, the 116, were buried at sea, and 57 of those 116 were among the identified dead. Of those who were brought to shore, 60 lay unnamed at the curling rink on the edge of the town. It was believed that the 60 were all members of the Titanic's crew, but the slender hope that their own dead might be among them sent many to the rink. One of the 60 was a little baby girl. 5 of them were women, but none of the women that were found were from the first cabin passengers. There was no hope that the body of Mrs. Strauss was among them. There was practically no hope that Major Butt was among the unnamed 60. The quest of the Mackay Bennett bore greater results than were anticipated, and Captain Lardner believed that his ship recovered about all of those who did not go down in the Titanic. The search was continued over 5 days, sometimes with the ship drifting without success amid miles and miles of wreckage, tables, chairs, doors, pillows, scattered fragments of the luxury that was the White Star liner Titanic. At other times the bodies were found close together, and once they saw more than 100 that looked to the wondering crew of the Mackay Bennett like a flock of seagulls in the fog, so strangely did the ends of the lifebelts rise and fall with the rise and fall of the waves. Those whose dead the Mackay Bennett brought to shore came forward with their claims, and from the middle of the afternoon the rest of the day was filled with the steps of identification and the signing of many papers. The first to be claimed was John Jacob Astor, and for his death was issued the first accidental drowning death certificate of the hundreds who lost their lives in the wreck of the Titanic. Vincent Astor and Nicholas Biddle started for New York with the body the next night. The body of Isidor Strauss identified. The second identified was Isidor Strauss. The start for New York was made early the next morning. 3 went on the same night. These were George E. Graham, Milton C. Long, and C. C. Jones. Lawrence Millett has identified his father. Friends quickly took charge of the bodies of E. H. Kent, W. D. Douglas, Timothy McCarty, George Rosenshine, E. C. Ostby, E. G. Crosby, William C. Porter, A. O. Holverson, Emil Brandeis, Thomas McCafferty, Wyckoff Vanderhoof, and A. S. Nicholson. Sharp and distinct in all the tidings the Mackay-Bennett brought to shore, the fact stands out that 57 of those who were identified on board were recommitted to the sea. Of the 190 identified dead that were recovered from the scene of the Titanic wreck, only 130 were brought to Halifax. This news, which was given out almost immediately after the death ship reached her pier, was a confirmation of the suspicion that in the last few days had seized upon the colony of those waiting here to claim their dead. Yet it came as a deep, a stirring surprise. It stunned the White Star men, who have had to direct the work from Halifax. They had been confidently posting the names of the recovered as the wireless brought the news in from the Atlantic. When the suspicion arose that some of the identified might have been buried at sea, the White Star people said that they did not know, but they were working on the assumption that Captain Lardner would bring them all to port, and that only the unidentifiable had been recommitted to the sea. The unnamed dead. Then they learned that the Mackay-Bennett had brought in 60 unidentified. The hallway of the curling rink, where the dead were removed from the cable ship, was thronged all afternoon with friends and relatives, eager beyond expression to see those unnamed dead, but the attention of the embalmers was turned to those already identified, for whom the claimants were waiting. For the most part, the unidentified could not be viewed until the next morning. One of them was thought to be Arthur White, a member of the Titanic's crew. The suspense was acute, yet those who were most anxious for the morrow to come knew that hope was of the slenderest. They knew that the nameless 60 were almost all members of the crew. Captain Lardner said that he was sure of it. He knew it by the clothes they wore. As to the 57 identified dead that were buried at sea, the whole colony was stirred by pity that it had to be, and not a few wonder if it really had to be, a wonder fed by the talk of some of the embalmers. Yet few were immediately concerned. Most of those in Halifax were waiting for men who sailed first cabin of the Titanic. It appears that only one of these was among those who were buried at sea. This was Frederick Sutton of Philadelphia. The large majority were either members of the Titanic's crew or steerage passengers. Of the 116 that Captain Lardner thought best to return to the sea, he explained that the unidentified seemed unidentifiable, that the identified were too mutilated to bring to shore. "Let me say first of all," he announced when the reporters gathered around him, "that I was commissioned to bring aboard all the bodies found floating, but owing to the unanticipated number of bodies found, owing to the bad weather and other conditions, it was impossible to carry out instructions, so some were committed to the deep after service, conducted by Canon Hind." Captain Lardner explained that neither he nor any of his people had dreamed that so many of the Titanic's dead would be found floating on the surface of the Atlantic. Only 106 bodies preserved. It was more than his embalmer could handle, for although the material for embalming 70 bodies, which was all that Halifax sent out with the Mackay-Bennett, was supplemented at sea by materials borrowed from the Minia, the number of dead so preserved for the return to shore was only 106. He did not know how long he would have to stay at his grim work on the scene of the wreck. He did not know how long bad weather would impede the homeward voyage. He did not know how long he could safely carry the multitude of dead. It seemed best to recommit some of them to the sea, and so on 3 different days 116 were weighted down and dropped over the edge of the ship into the Atlantic. Then rose the question as to why some were picked for burial at sea and others left on board to be brought home to the waiting families on shore. The reporters put the question to the captain, and he answered it. No prominent man was recommitted to the deep. It seemed best to embalm as quickly as possible in those cases where large property might be involved. It seemed best to be sure to bring back to land the dead where the death might give rise to such questions as large insurance and inheritance and all the litigation. Most of those who were buried out there were members of the Titanic's crew. The man who lives by the sea ought to be satisfied to be buried at sea. I think it is the best place. For my own part, I should be contented to be committed to the deep. To emphasize the uncertainty of the task he directed, Captain Lardner pointed silently to the forward hold, where an hour before those on the pier had seen the dead lying side by side on the floor, each in the wrapping of tarpaulin. They were ready for burial, the captain said. We had the weights in them, for we didn't know when we should have to give them up. A few more bodies recovered. To those who hoped to find their owner among the unidentified in the curling ring tomorrow, Captain Lardner held out little encouragement except the prospect that the quest of the Minya may result in a few more bodies being recovered. He believed that his own ship gathered in most of those who were kept afloat by the lifebelts. Almost all of the rest, in his opinion, went down with the rush of waters that closed over the Titanic, driving them down in the hatchways and holding the dead imprisoned in the great wreck. Survivors told of many pistol shots heard in those dark moments when the last lifeboats were putting off, and though the pier on the night the Carpathia landed was astir with rumours of men shot down as they fought to save their lives, not one of the bodies that were recovered yesterday had any pistol shots, according to Captain Lardner and the members of his crew. The mutilations which marked so many were broken arms and legs and crushed skulls, where the living on the Titanic were swept amongst the stanchions by the onrush of the sea. The little repair shop on the Mackay Bennett was a treasure house when she came to port. $15,000 in money was found on the recovered bodies, and jewellery that will be worth a king's ransom. One of the crew related his experience with one dead man whose pockets he turned inside out, only to have 17 diamonds roll out in every direction upon the littered deck. It was a little after 9:30 that the Mackay Bennett was sighted by those waiting for her since the break of day, for it was in the chill of 6 o'clock on a Canadian spring morning that the people began to assemble on the pier in the dockyard. They were undertakers for the most part, mingling with the newspaper men who hurried to and fro between the water's edge and the little bell tent set up a few yards back to guard the wires that were to flash the news to the ends of the continent. Watch for men with cameras. The dockyard was patrolled by 20 members of the crew and 4 petty officers from HMCS Niobe, and by a squad of men from the Dominion Police, who were instructed to keep out all without passes countersigned by the commandant, and who were particularly vigilant in the watch for men with cameras. Just as the death ship reached her pier, and in the midst of the eager movement forward to learn what news she brought forth from the scene of the Titanic's wreck, a little tug was spotted nearby, and Commander Martin, in charge of the dockyard, scented a moving picture man. In a very few moments he was putting out for the tug in the little patrol launch. Again a few minutes, and he was standing on the pier with a complacent smile on his face. "I have the films," he said in explanation, so the privacy was guarded. The friends and relatives of those who were lost when the great liner went down were urged not to assume the ordeal of meeting the Mackay Bennett. Almost without exception they followed this advice, and only a scattering few could be seen amongst those waiting on the pier. In all the crowd of men, officials, undertakers, and newspaper men, there was just one woman, solitary, spare, clasping her heavy black shawl tightly around her. This was Eliza Laurette, for more than 30 years in the service of Mrs. William August Spencer, who was waiting at her home on East 86th Street, New York, while Miss Laurette had journeyed to Halifax to seek the body of Mr. Spencer, who went down with the Titanic. So the crowd that waited on the pier was made up almost entirely of men who had impersonal business there, and the air was full of the chatter and conjecture and preparation. Then, warned by the tolling of bells up in the town, a hush fell upon the waiting people. The grey clouds that had overcast the sky parted, and the sun shone brilliantly on the rippling water of the harbour as the Mackay Bennett drew alongside her pier. The dead lay everywhere. Captain Lardner could be seen upon the bridge. The crew hung over the sides, joyously alive and glad to be home. But in every part of the ship the dead lay. High on the poop deck, coffins and rough shells were piled and piled. Dead men in tarpaulins lined the flooring of the cable wells, both fore and aft, so that there was hardly room for a foot to be put down. And in the forward hold dead men were piled one upon another, their eyes closed as in sleep, and over them all a great tarpaulin was stretched. Those that pressed forward to see were sickened and turned back. The business of moment was to discharge that freight, and this was done with all possible dispatch. The uncoffined dead were carried down in stretchers, placed in the rough shells that were piled upon the pier, and one by one driven up the slope and into the town in the long line of hearses and black undertakers' wagons that had been gathered from every quarter. It was speedily done, but quietly and without irreverent haste. For 2 hours this business proceeded before anyone could go upon the pier, and the sounds were like the hum of a small factory. There were the muffled orders, the shuffling and tramping of feet, the scraping as of packing boxes drawn across the rough flooring, and the eternal hammering that echoed all along the coal sheds. 2 hours it was before anyone could go on board, and then came another hour when the coffins were swung down from the deck and piled up on the wharf ready for the removal that took until well into the middle of the afternoon. Few of the relatives were allowed to pass beyond the cordon that stretched all about the pier at which the dead were landed. One of the first to get through the lines and the first of all the waiting crowd to make his way aboard after the ship reached her pier was Captain Richard Roberts of the Astor yacht, who was filled with a great concern at the news that had come from the Widener party. Not Mr. Widener. For long before the Mackay Bennett reached her pier it was established as definitely as it may ever be established that the man who was picked up at sea for George D. Widener was not Mr. Widener, but his manservant Edward Keating. Although the name was sent in by wireless, a later examination of the dead man's clothing and effects proved that it was Keating's body. A letter in the pocket was addressed to Mr. Widener, but the coat was labelled E.K., and the garments were of an inferior quality. Identification by features was out of the question, for the dead man had been struck by some spar or bit of wreckage, and the face was mutilated past recognition. He was buried at sea, and the news sent on to the waiting family. Young Mr. Widener, who had been waiting here for a week with a private car to carry the body of his father home to Philadelphia, had heard of the uncertainty, and in a fever of impatience he met the Mackay Bennett at Quarantine, went over the effects with Captain Lardner, and was satisfied that it was Keating whose body was found and who was later committed to the deep. The haunting fear that this same error might have been made in the case of Colonel Astor had possession of the whole Astor party, and grew acute as the Widener story went out. That was what sent Captain Roberts hurrying to the ship. He was admitted and saw for himself. The coffin top was removed on board. The plain gold ring and the 2 little diamonds set deep, the gold buckle on the belt that Colonel Astor always wore, and a sum amounting to nearly £3,000 in the pockets settled the uncertainty. 20 minutes after he had boarded the ship, Captain Roberts was hurrying through the crowd to reach the nearest telephone that he might speed the news to waiting Vincent Astor. Questions of identity. Beyond these 2 cases, the questions of identity were taken up at the Mayflower curling rink at the edge of the town, where the line of hearses had been trundling since the Mackay Bennett landed. As they passed, the crowds were hushed, men bowed their heads, and officers saluted. At the rink, the great main floor was given over to the coffins and shells containing the identified dead, and as soon as the embalmers had done their work, the friends and relatives came forward and claimed their own. Upstairs in the large bare room the packets of clothing were distributed in rows upon the floor. There the oak chests of the provincial cashier were opened for the sorting of the canvas bags that contained the valuables, the letters, and the identifying trinkets of the dead. It was all very systematic. It was all very much businesslike, and when a lunch counter served refreshments to the weary workers, and while the Intercolonial set up a desk for railway tickets, the medical examiner was busy issuing death certificates, and the registrar was issuing burial permits, all to the accompanying click-click of several typewriters. A satisfactory arrangement was reached as to the disposition of the personal effects. A man would claim his dead, take the number, make his way to the representatives of the provincial secretary, and there claim the contents of the little canvas bag by making affidavit that he was the duly authorized representative of the executor or next of kin. The little crimson tickets that are the death certificates were printed for the tragedies for every day in the year. Their formal points and dimensions seemed hopelessly inadequate for even the briefest statement of the tragedy of the Titanic. Certificate for the dead. The first body claimed and removed from the rink was that of John Jacob Astor. The certificate, the first issued for one of the Titanic dead, reads, "Name of deceased, John Jacob Astor. Sex, M. Age, 47. Date of death, April 15, 1912. Residence, street, etc. 840 Fifth Avenue, New York City. Occupation, gentleman. Married. Cause, accidental drowning. SS Titanic at sea. Length of illness, suddenly. Name of physician in attendance." Such details as these filled the day. After the greater part of the Titanic's dead had been shifted from the Mackay Bennett to the pier, Captain Lardner descended to the dining-room, and with the reporters from all over the country gathered round the table, he opened the ship's log, and slowly tracing his fingers over the terse entries, he told them the story of the death ship's voyage. Lardner is English by birth and accent, and tall and square of build, with a full brown beard and eyes of unusual keenness. "We left Halifax," he began, "shortly after noon on Wednesday, April 17th, but fog and bad weather delayed us on the run out, and we did not get there till Saturday night at 8 o'clock. We asked all ships to report to us if they passed any wreckage or bodies, and on Saturday at noon we received a communication from the German mail-boat steamship Rhine, to the effect that in latitude 42.1 north, longitude 49.13, she had passed wreckage and bodies. The course was shaped for that position. Later in the afternoon we spoke to the German steamship Bremen, and they reported having passed 3 large icebergs and some bodies in 42 north, 49.20 west. We arrived on the scene at 8 o'clock Saturday evening, and then we stopped and let the ship drift. It was in the middle of the watch that some of the wreckage and a few bodies were sighted. At daylight the boats were lowered, and though there was a heavy sea running at the time, 51 bodies were recovered. The Reverend Canon K.C. Hines, rector of All Saints Cathedral, who officiated at the burial of 116 bodies, the greatest number consigned to the ocean at one time, tells the story of the Mackay Bennett's trip as follows. Our journey slow. We left Halifax shortly after noon on April 17th, and had not proceeded far when fog set in so that our journey was slow. We reached the vicinity of the wreckage on Saturday evening. Early on Sunday morning the search for bodies began, when the captain and other officers of the ship kept a lookout from the bridge. Soon the command was given, "Stand by the boat," and a little later the lifeboat was lowered and the work begun of picking up the bodies as they were pointed out in the water to the crew. Through the day some 50 were picked up. All were carefully examined and their effects placed in separate bags, all bodies and bags being numbered. It was deemed wise that some of them should be buried. At 8 p.m. the ship's bell was tolled to indicate all was in readiness for the service. Standing on the bow of the ship as she rocked to and fro, one gazed at the starry heavens and across the boundless deep, and to his mind the psalmist's words came with mighty force. "Whither shall I go then from thy spirit, or whither shall I go then from thy presence? If I ascend up to heaven, thou art there. I make my bed in the grave, thou art there also. And if I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost part of the sea, even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. In the solemn stillness of the early night, the words of that unequal burial office rang across the waters. I am the resurrection and the life, saith the Lord. He that believeth in me shall never die. When the time of committal came, these words were used over each body. Commit his body to the deep. Forasmuch as it had pleased Almighty God to take up to himself the soul of our dear brother departed, we therefore commit his body to the deep to be turned to corruption, looking for the resurrection of the body, when the sea shall give up her dead, and the life of the world to come, through Jesus Christ our Lord, who shall change our vile body, that it may be like unto his glorious body, according to the mighty working whereby he is able to subdue all things to himself. The prayers from the burial service were said, and hymn, Jesus, lover of my soul, sung, and the blessing given. Anyone attending a burial at sea will most surely lose the common impression of the awfulness of a grave in the mighty deep. The wild Atlantic may rage and toss, the shipwrecked mariners cry for mercy, but far below in the calm untroubled depth they rest in peace. On Monday the work began again early in the morning, and another day was spent in searching and picking up the floating bodies, and at night a number were buried. On Tuesday the work was still the same until the afternoon, when the fog set in, and continued all day Wednesday. Wednesday was partly spent in examining bodies, and at noon a number were committed to the deep. Thursday came in fine, and from early morning until evening the work went on. During the day, word came that the cable ship Minia was on her way to help and would be near us at midnight. Early on Friday some more bodies were picked up. The captain felt that we had covered the ground fairly well and decided to start our homeward way at noon. After receiving some supplies from the Minia, we said goodbye and proceeded on our way. The Mackay Bennett succeeded in finding 306 bodies, of which 116 were buried at sea, and one could not help feeling, as we steamed homeward, that of those bodies we had on board, it would be well if the greater number of them were resting in the deep. It is to be noted how earnestly and reverently all the work was done, and how nobly the crew acquitted themselves during a work of several days, which meant a hard and trying strain on mind and body. What seems a very regrettable fact is that in chartering the Mackay Bennett for this work, the White Star Company did not send an official agent to accompany the steamer in her searches for the bodies. End of chapter 21.
Section 22 of Sinking of the Titanic, Most Appalling Ocean Horror. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Donald Warren. Sinking of the Titanic, Most Appalling Ocean Horror by Jay Henry Mowbray. Inquiry by United States Senate. Loading at the rail, inadequate life-saving appliances, no extra lookout, searchlights blinding, wireless rivals not all aroused, went to death in sleep, scratched seamen, cries of agony, a pitiful story, senators ascertain pertinent facts, much good accomplished. What has been accomplished by the senatorial inquiry into the loss of the Titanic was 1,600 lives. For more than a week of the two that have elapsed since the Titanic made a record of her maiden voyage, a record never paralleled in marine history for its horrors, its sacrifice of life and material property, an earnest body of United States senators have been at work conscientiously striving to uncover the facts, not alone for the purpose of placing the responsibility for what has now become one of the most heart-rending chapters in all ocean history, but also in the hope of framing remedial legislation looking to the prevention of its recurrence. To attempt to draw conclusions as to the value of the work of a committee which is yet upon the threshold of its task, would be presumptuous, but it is not too soon to present and formulate some of the pertinent facts which its researches have established in the light of sworn evidence. Any attempt at systematic analysis of the facts deduced from the many thousands of pages of testimony already taken naturally divided itself into two departments. Were the Titanic's equipment and her general state of preparedness such as to justify the broad claims made in her behalf before the crisis arose, that she represented the acme of human possibility not only in ocean-going comfort and speed, but also in safety at sea? Were the personnel and discipline of her officers and crew of such a standard that, after the supreme crisis confronted them, they utilized to the best advantage such facilities for the safeguarding and preservation of life as remained at their disposal? With 10,000 families on both sides of the Atlantic mourning the untimely death of relatives and friends who went down into the depths from the decks of a brand new ship, widely proclaimed the greatest and the safest that ever plowed the sea, these are, after all, the most pertinent questions that may be asked by a sorrowing world as it looks to the future rather than the past. Life-saving apparatus inadequate. It has been demonstrated and frankly conceded by the company's managers and officers in the light of after-knowledge that the Titanic's life-saving appliances were woefully inadequate to the safeguarding of even one-half of her complement of passengers and crew. On the day after the disaster was known to the world, it was shown that the ship's equipment of lifeboats complied with the requirements of the English Board of Trade, but that those requirements were so obsolete and antiquated that they dated back to 1898 and were drafted to provide for vessels of less than 1/4 the gross tonnage of the mammoth craft of 46,000 tons of displacement. The Titanic carried on her boat deck, sometimes referred as to her sun deck, 14 of the largest regulation-sized lifeboats, 7 on her port side and 7 on the starboard. Each of these had a carrying capacity, according to the Board of Trade's established method of computation, of 65.5 persons. Their aggregate capacity when afloat, therefore, was 917. The ship carried in addition 4 of the so-called collapsible boats and 2 others known as emergency boats, comparatively small craft employed in occasional duty, as when a man falls overboard. The combined capacity of these 6 when afloat was hardly more than sufficient to care for 200 persons. At the most liberal estimate, therefore, the entire equipment of boats aboard the Great White Star liner may have afforded refuge in the most favorable conditions to less than 1,200 persons, or not quite half the number actually aboard the ship on her maiden voyage. In stating the lifeboat capacity, the term "when afloat" has been used advisedly. One of the points which each of the Titanic survivor officers has emphasized in evidence is the vast difference between loading with its human freight a boat that has already been placed in the water and loading one at the rail from a deck 75 feet above the water, with the subsequent perils of lowering it by means of the tackles sustaining its weight from bow and stern. Several of the officers have said that in lowering loaded boats from the rail of the Titanic's boat deck, they would consider it unwise and even dangerous to fill the boats to more than one-half their rated capacity. All the lifeboats that went away from the Titanic were loaded and lowered from the rail. Some of the smaller collapsible and emergency boats did not get away at all until the ship was so low in the water that they were simply pushed overboard, and one of them went over bottom up. Boat carries 58 persons. Harold G. Lowe, the 5th officer, commanded a boat which carried 58 persons aboard. This, so far as is known, is the largest number of passengers carried in any one of the lifeboats. Mr. Lowe testified that as his craft was lowered away from the davits, he feared momentarily that, as a result of the tremendous strain upon her structure, she would buckle amidships and break before she reached the sustaining surface of the water, dropping all into the sea. Had one more person leaped aboard her amidships as she was going down past the other decks, he said, it might well have proved to be the last straw. Mr. Lowe feared this might happen, as he saw steerage passengers glaring at the boat as it was loaded past the decks whereupon they stood. It was for that reason, he explained to the investigating committee, that he discharged his revolver 3 times into the air as he and his boatload were dropping past the 3 lower decks. His purpose, he said, was to show that he was armed and to prevent any effort to overload the craft beyond a point which he already considered perilous. C.H. Lightoller, second officer and ranking surviving officer of the Titanic, expressed the opinion that in filling lifeboats from the Titanic's boat deck at the rail, it was involving serious risk to load them to more than 1/2 the rated capacity for filling while afloat. H.T. Boxall, fourth officer, expressed a like view, but added that in an extreme emergency, one man might take more chances than another. In view of these expert opinions, it will be seen that, when it came to loading the Titanic's passengers into lifeboats from the rail, the actual life-saving capacity of their available equipment was far less than the 1,000 or 1,100 that might have been carefully packed away into boats already resting safely on the surface of a calm sea. A puzzling query. And this consideration naturally suggests the query, why were the Titanic's lifeboats all loaded from the rail of the topmost deck at a point fully 70 feet above the sea? Why were they not lowered empty, or with only the necessary officers or crew aboard, and then filled with their quota of passengers either from some lower deck or else after they had reached the sustaining surface of the water? It is evident that course was contemplated. 3 of the surviving officers have testified that the available force of seamen was depleted after the ship struck because a detail of men had been sent below to open up the gangway doors for the purpose of embarking the passengers into the lifeboats from those outlets. There is nothing in evidence as yet to show that this purpose was ever accomplished, or to reveal the faith of the men sent to do the work. Whether the men were unable or incompetent to force open the gangway doors from which the lowered boats might easily have been filled, as the sea was as smooth as a mill pond, whether these outlets were jammed as a result of collision with the berg or stuck because the ship's mechanisms were new, has not been revealed and may never be known. Certain it is that all the lifeboats were loaded from the rail, and their safe capacity was thereby reduced 1/2 in the judgment of the officers to whom their command was entrusted. The inadequacy of the Titanic's lifeboat appliances is not disputed. Steamship companies are already vying with one another to correct in this respect the admitted shortcomings of the past. The sole excuse offered is that collision bulkheads, watertight compartments, and other like devices have been regarded until now as making the marvelous vessels of the present day their own best lifeboats. The Titanic and many of her sister ships of the ocean fleets have been called unsinkable. They were generally believed to be so, and it is only since this greatest of disasters has shattered many illusions that marine engineers have confessed ruefully that the unsinkable ship has never yet been launched. Perils minimized. Since the day of the watertight compartment and of the wireless telegraph, sea perils have been so minimized that in the most extreme of likely emergencies, the function of the lifeboat has come to be regarded as of an ocean ferry capable of transferring passengers safely and leisurely from an imperiled vessel to another standing by and cooperating in the task. This was all the lifeboat had to do when the Republic sank. That was all they had to do years ago when the Missouri, under Captain Hamilton Muirgel's expert management, took off 1,000 persons from a foundering ship without the loss of a single life. So it had come to be believed that the lifeboats would never be called upon to do more than that, and least of all in the case of the Titanic, latest and most superb of all the vessels built by man since the world began. So deep-rooted was this conviction in the minds of seagoing men that when Senator Smith of Michigan, chairman of the investigating committee, asked one of the surviving officers what was the purpose of the Titanic carrying her 14 full-size lifeboats, he naively replied, "To comply, I suppose, with the regulations of the London Board of Trade." There has been no evidence to indicate that the Titanic lacked the proper number of life jackets or life belts, one for every person aboard the ship, and it has not been proven that these life belts were not new and of proper quality and strength. Major Pugin of Toronto One of the surviving passengers, however, in the course of his testimony, made two significant comments. He said that when the Carpathia, on the morning after the disaster, steamed through a lot of the Titanic's floating wreckage, he was surprised to note great quantities of broken bits of cork, such as are used in life preservers. He was astonished also that he did not see a larger number of floating bodies. "I have always supposed," said Major Pugin, who is an experienced yachtsman, "that a life preserver in good condition would sustain a dead body as well as a live one." Steaming at 21 knots. It has been demonstrated by ample evidence that at the time the Titanic hit the iceberg, she was steaming at the undiminished speed of 21 knots an hour into a zone littered with icebergs and floating ice fields, warning of which her officers had received hours before by wireless from several other ships, including the America of the Hamburg American Line. When day broke on Monday, according to Mr. Lynne, at least 20 icebergs surrounded the Carpathia, the largest of which was 150 feet high. They were within a 6-mile radius. In the chart room, tucked into the corner of a frame above the table where the navigating officers of the Titanic did their mathematical work, was a written memorandum of the latitude and longitude wherein 2 large icebergs had been reported directly in the track. Mr. Boxhall had worked out this position under Captain Smith's instructions. Mr. Lightoller, the second officer, was familiar with it, and when his watch ended at 10 o'clock Sunday night and he surrendered the post on the bridge to the first officer, Mr. Murdoch, the remark was made that they would probably be getting up into the ice during Mr. Murdoch's watch. Despite all this, the Titanic was rushing on, driving at railroad speed toward the port of New York and a record for a maiden voyage. It was a cloudless and starlit night with no sea running. No extra lookout was posted in the ship's eyes, the most advanced position on the vessel's deck. Up in the crow's nest, Fleet and Lee, both experienced lookouts, were keeping a sharp watch forward. They had been duly warned of ice by the pair of lookouts whom they had relieved. Unaided by sea glasses. But the men in the crow's nest had to depend entirely upon the vision of the naked eye. They had no glass to aid them. Fleet had occupied a similar post of responsibility 4 years on the Oceanic without mishap. His testimony before the committee was that he never before had been without the aid of a glass. He had a pair of binoculars when the ship made her trial trip from Belfast, but they had been mislaid, and when the Titanic steamed out from Southampton, he asked Mr. Lightoller for another pair and was told that there was no glass for him. Fleet's warning was too late to prevent the impact. His testimony was that with a glass, he would have reported the berg in time to have prevented the ship striking it. When Quartermaster Hitchens came on watch at 10 o'clock, the weather had grown so cold that he, experienced seaman that he was, immediately thought of icebergs, though it was no part of his duty to look out for them. The thermometer showed 31 degrees, and the first orders he received were to notify the ship's carpenter to look into his fresh water supply because of the freezing weather and to turn on the steam heating apparatus in the officers' quarters. Still no extra lookout was placed, and the men in the crow's nest were straining their tired eyes ahead without the help of a lens. Captain Arthur Rostrom of the Carpathia testified when he was rushing his ship to the aid of the stricken Titanic, taking unusual chances because he knew lives were at stake, he placed a double watch on duty. Each of the surviving officers, when he was questioned as to the Titanic's speed at a time when the proximity of dangerous ice was definitely reported and clearly indicated by the drop in temperature, said it was not customary to slacken speed at such times, provided the weather was clear. The custom is, they said, to go ahead and depend upon the lookouts in the crow's nest and the watch on the bridge to pick up the ice in time to avoid hitting it. Mr. Lowe, the fifth officer, who was crossing the Atlantic for the first time in his life, most of his 14 years' experience at sea having been in the southern and eastern oceans, yawned wearily in the face of the examiner, as he admitted that he had never heard that icebergs were common off the banks of Newfoundland, and that the fact would not have interested him if he had. He did not know that the Titanic was following what is known as the Southern Track, and when he was asked, ventured the guess that she was on the northerly one. Might have been saved by searchlight. Questions framed by Senator Smith several times have suggested that the use of a searchlight might have saved the Titanic. Warships of all nations make the searchlight a part of their regular equipment, as is well known. The Titanic's surviving officers agreed that it has not been commonly used by vessels of the merchant marine. Some of them conceded that in the conditions surrounding the Titanic, its use on a clear night might have revealed the iceberg in time to have saved the ship. Major Puchin of Toronto said emphatically that it would have done so. Mr. Lightoller, however, pointed out that while the searchlight is often a useful device for those who stand behind it, its rays invariably blind those upon whom they are trained. Should the use of searchlights become general upon merchant vessels, he thought, it would be a matter for careful consideration, experiment, and regulation. The senatorial inquiry has indicated that the single lifeboat drill upon the Titanic had been a rather perfunctory performance. There had been neither a boat drill nor a fire drill from the time the great ship left Southampton until she struck the iceberg. While she lay in harbor before starting on her maiden voyage, and with her port side against the company pier, 2 of her lifeboats had been lowered away from her starboard side, manned by a junior or a warrant officer and a crew of 4 men each, who rowed them around a few minutes and then returned to the ship. There had also been an inspection in the home port to see whether the lifeboats contained all the gear specified by the Board of Trade Regulations, and Officer Boxhall testified that they did. Yet when the emergency came, many of the boats were found to contain no lights, while others lacked extra oars, biscuits, or other specified requisites. Utility of watertight compartments doubted. The Titanic's loss has completely exploded the fallacy that watertight compartments, of which the big ship had 15 in her main divisions, can save a vessel from foundering after having sustained a raking blow, tearing and ripping out her plates from 30 feet aft of the bow almost to midships. Mr. Lightoller expressed the belief under oath that the starboard side of the Titanic had been pierced through compartments 1, 2, 3, and probably 4, numbering from the collision bulkhead toward the midship section. The testimony of Quartermaster Hitchens showed that the vessel filled so fast that when the captain looked at the commutator 5 minutes after the ship struck, the Titanic showed a list of 5 degrees to starboard. Rushing water drove the clerks out of the mailroom before they could save their letter bags. One reform that is likely to take shape early as a result of the senatorial investigation is a more thorough regulation of wireless telegraphy, both in shore stations and on ships at sea. Interference by irresponsible operators will probably be checked by governmental agencies, and the whole subject may come up for uniform international regulation in the Berlin Conference. It is conceded that on all ships the receiving apparatus of the wireless instruments should be manned at all hours of the day and night, just as are the ship's bridge and the engine rooms. The Senate inquiry has showed that had the death call of the Titanic gone out 5 minutes later, it would have never reached the Carpathia, whose one-wire operator was about to retire for the night when he heard the signal that took the Cunarder to the rescue of the 700 who survived. There has been shown, too, grave need of some cure for the jealousies and rivalries between competing systems of wireless. To the Frankfurt, which was one of the nearest, if not the nearest, of the several ships to the sinking Titanic, her operator sent the curt message, "Shut up." From the Californian, the operator refused to take a message, which proved to be an ice warning because he was busy with his accounts. With the sanction of high officers of their company, wireless operators have suppressed vital public information for the purpose of commercializing their exclusive knowledge for personal profit. So much for the Titanic's boasted equipment, or the lack of it. There remains to be summarized the evidence adduced as to the personnel and discipline, as these were indicated by what occurred after the ship confronted the direst of all emergencies. The Titanic was expected to make a record on her maiden voyage. She made one unapproached in ocean annals, of which, it is hoped, may long stand unparalleled. Report censures Captain of Californian. Says all passengers might have been saved, but for Captain Lord's indifference. Titanic Committee's report. that the Titanic was rushing at a speed of 24.5 miles an hour when she crashed into the iceberg, that of 2,223 persons aboard, only 32% were saved, that all might have been saved but for negligent indifference of the steamship Californian to the Titanic's distress signals, that those rescued comprised 60% of the first-class passengers, 42% of second class, 25% of third class, and 24% of the crew, that 4 warnings of ice ahead were ignored by the Titanic's officers, that the Titanic struck at 10:13 p.m. on Sunday, April 14, and sank at 12:47 a.m. New York time on April 15, that 8 vessels were near at time of the collision with the iceberg, and only the Carpathia went to the assistance of the Titanic, that there was no panic, but a short crew, poorly drilled and poorly commanded, only enough men to partially man the 20 lifeboats, teeming with eloquence, combining praise for heroism and scathing rebuke for negligence and cowardice in the most appalling marine tragedy of history, was the final and official requiem on May 28th in the Senate for the victims of the Titanic. Senator Smith of Michigan, chairman of the Senate Investigating Committee, summed up his views of the evidence developed, that every soul aboard the giant liner might have been saved but for the indifference, inattention, and almost criminal neglect of Captain Stanley Lord and the other officers of the Californian was the most startling charge Smith bitterly made. Needless sacrifice of at least 500 lives because the strangely inefficient number of lifeboats were not filled was also charged. Obsolete and antiquated shipping laws and laxity of regulation and hasty inspection by the British Board of Trade were denounced by Smith. As a contributory clause, he named the indifference of Captain Smith of the Titanic for ignoring ice warnings and forcing the Titanic full speed through the northern waters. That Captain Smith had expiated his offense by a heroic death was Smith's tribute to the dead commander. Lack of discipline arranged. Lack of discipline among the crew and cowardice of some of its members, indicated after the crash, was scathingly arranged. To the 2 Titanic wireless operators, Phillips and Bride, the speaker paid a glowing tribute. He lauded Captain Rostrom of the rescue ship Carpathia. In eloquent terms, the chairman, Senator Smith, depicted the folly of sending out the greatest ship afloat without sufficiently testing a strange crew and with no drills or discipline. The Titanic, he said, was following the proper course, although one known to be dangerous at that season, but the speed was gradually and continually increased until the maximum was the death blow. Rebuke for those in half-filled lifeboats who stood by and refused aid to struggling, drowning swimmers until all the noise had ceased, was voiced. Upon that broken hull, the senator concluded, new vows were taken, new fealty expressed, old love renewed, and those who had been devoted in life went proudly and defiantly on the last life pilgrimage together. In such a heritage, we must feel ourselves more intimately related to the sea than ever before, and henceforth it will be sent back to us on its rising tide, the cheerful salutations from those we have lost. At 10 o'clock on that fateful Sunday evening, this latest maritime creation was cutting its first pathway through the North Atlantic Ocean with scarcely a ripple to retard its progress. From the builder's hands she was plunged straightway to her faith, and christening salvos acclaimed at once her birth and death. Builders of renown had launched her on the billows with confident assurance of her strength, while every port rang with praise for their achievement. Shipbuilding to them was both a science and a religion. Parent ships and sister ships had easily withstood the waves, while the mark of their hammer was all that was needed to give assurance of the high quality of the work. In the construction of the Titanic, no limit of cost circumscribed their endeavor, and when this vessel took its place at the head of the line, every modern improvement in shipbuilding was supposed to have been realized. So confident were they that both owner and builder were eager to go upon the trial trip. No sufficient tests were made of boilers or bulkheads, or gearing or equipment, and no life-saving or signal devices were reviewed. Officers and crew were strangers to one another and passengers to both. Passengers and crew stupefied. Neither was familiar with the vessel or its implements or tools. No drill or station practice or helpful discipline disturbed the tranquility of that voyage, and when the crisis came, a state of absolute unpreparedness stupefied both passengers and crew, and in their despair the ship went down, carrying as needless a sacrifice of noble women and brave men as ever clustered about the judgment seat in any single moment of passing time. We shall leave to the honest judgment of England its painstaking chastisement of the British Board of Trade, to whose laxity of regulation and hasty inspection the world is largely indebted for this awful fatality. Of contributing causes there were very many. In the face of warning signals, speed was increased, and messages of danger seemed to stimulate her to action rather than to persuade her to fear. Captain Smith knew the sea, and his clear eye and steady hand had often guided his ship through dangerous paths. For 40 years storms sought in vain to vex him or menace his craft, but once before in all his honorable career was his pride humbled or his vessel maimed. Each new advancing type of ship built by his company was handed over to him as a reward for faithful service and as an evidence of confidence in his skill. Strong of limb, intent of purpose, pure in character, dauntless as a sailor should be, he walked the deck of this majestic structure as master of her keel, Titanic though she was. His indifference to danger was one of the direct and contributing causes of this unnecessary tragedy, while his own willingness to die was the expiating evidence of his fitness to live. Overconfidence and neglect. Those of us who knew him well, not in anger but in sorrow, file one specific charge against him: overconfidence and neglect to heed the oft-repeated warnings of his friends. But in his horrible dismay, when his brain was afire with honest retribution, we can still see in his manly bearing and his tender solicitude for the safety of women and little children some traces of his lofty spirit when dark clouds lowered all about him and angry elements stripped him of his command. His devotion to his craft, even as it writhed and twisted and struggled for mastery over its foe, calmed the fears of many of the stricken multitude who hung upon his words, lending dignity to a parting scene as inspiring as it is beautiful to remember. Lifebelts were finally adjusted, and the lifeboats were cleared away, and although strangely insufficient in number, were only partially loaded, and in instances unprovided with compasses, and only 3 of them had lamps. They were manned so badly that, in the absence of prompt relief, they would have fallen easy victims to the advancing ice floe, nearly 30 miles in width and rising 16 feet above the surface of the water. Their danger would have been as great as if they had remained on the deck of the broken hull, and if the sea had risen, these toy targets, with over 700 exhausted people, would have been helplessly tossed about upon the waves without food or water. The lifeboats were filled so indifferently and lowered so quickly that, according to the uncontradicted evidence, nearly 500 persons were needlessly sacrificed to want of orderly discipline in loading the few that were provided. The lifeboats would have easily cared for 1,176 and only contained 704, 12 of whom were taken into the boats from the water, while the weather conditions were favorable and the sea perfectly calm. And yet it is said by some well-meaning persons that the best of discipline prevailed. If this is discipline, what would have been disorder? Among the passengers were many strong men who had been accustomed to command, whose lives had marked every avenue of endeavor, and whose business experience and military training especially fitted them for such an emergency. Men rudely silenced. These men were rudely silenced and forbidden to speak, as was the president of the company, by junior officers, a few of whom, I regret to say, availed themselves of the first opportunity to leave the ship. Some of the men, to whom had been entrusted the care of passengers, never reported to their official stations, and quickly deserted the ship with a recklessness and indifference to the responsibilities of their positions as culpable and amazing as it is impossible to believe. And some of these men say that they laid by in their partially filled lifeboats and listened to the cries of distress until the noise quieted down, and surveyed from a safe distance the unselfish men and women and faithful fellow officers and seamen whose heroism lightens up this tragedy and recalls the noblest traditions of the sea. Some things are dearer than life itself, and the refusal of Phillips and Bride, wireless operators, to desert their post of duty, even after the water had mounted to the upper deck because the captain had not given them permission to leave, is an example of faithfulness worthy of the highest praise, while the final exit of the Phillips boy from the ship and from the world was not so swift as to prevent him from pausing long enough to pass a cup of water to a fainting woman, who fell from her husband's arms into the operator's chair as he was tardily fleeing from his wireless apparatus, where he had ticked off the last message from his ship and from his brain. It is no excuse that the apparatus on the Carpathia was antiquated. It easily caught the signal of distress and spoke with other ships nearly 200 miles away, both before and after the accident, while the operator says it was good for 250 miles. The steamship Californian was easily within reach of this ship for nearly 4 hours after all the facts were known to Operator Cottam. The captain of the Carpathia said he gave explicit directions that all official messages should be immediately sent through other ships, and messages of passengers should be given preference. According to Binns, the inspector, the apparatus on the Californian was practically new and easily tuned to carry every detail of that calamity to the coast stations at Cape Sable and Cape Race, and should have been done so. Criticism for Captain Lord. Regarding the part played after the disaster by Captain Lord of the steamship Californian, Senator Smith declared that, while it is not a pleasant duty to criticize the conduct of others, the plain truth should be told. Referring to the testimony of repeated signals given from the Californian with Morse lights, he declared, "Most of the witnesses of the ill-fated vessel before the committee saw plainly the light, which Captain Lord says was displayed for nearly 2 hours after the accident, while the captain and some of the officers of the Titanic directed the lifeboats to pull for that light and returned with empty boats to the side of the ship. Why did the Californian display its Morse signal lamp from the moment of the collision continuously for nearly 2 hours if they saw nothing? And the signals which were visible to Mr. Gill at 12:30 o'clock and afterward, and which were also seen by the captain and officer of the watch, should have excited more solicitude than was displayed by the officers of that vessel. And the failure of Captain Lord to arouse the wireless operator on his ship, who could have easily ascertained the name of the vessel in distress and reached her in time to avert the loss of life, places a tremendous responsibility upon this officer from which it will be very difficult for him to escape. Had he been as vigilant in the movement of his vessel as he was active in displaying his own signal lamp, there's a very strong probability that every human life that was sacrificed through this disaster could have been saved. The dictates of humanity should have prompted vigilance under such conditions, and the law of Great Britain, given effect to Article 2 of the Brussels Convention in regard to assistance and salvage at sea, is as follows. The master or persons in charge of a vessel shall, so far as he can do so without serious danger to his own vessel, her crew, and her passengers, if any, render assistance to every person, even if such person be a subject of a foreign state at war with his majesty, who is found at sea in danger of being lost, and if he fails to do so, he shall be guilty of a misdemeanor. Praise for Captain of Carpathia. The Senate passed on the 18th day of April last a bill giving effect to the same treaty, which clearly indicates the disposition of the government of England, and our own as well, in matters of this character. Contrast, if you will, the conduct of the captain of the Carpathia in this emergency, and imagine what must be the consolation of that thoughtful and sympathetic mariner who rescued the shipwrecked and left the people of the world his debtor as his ship sailed for distant seas a few days ago. By his utter self-effacement and his own indifference to peril, by his promptness and his knightly sympathy, he rendered a great service to humanity. He should be made to realize the debt of gratitude this nation owes to him, while the book of good deeds, which had so often been familiar with its unaffected valor, should henceforth carry the name of Captain Rostrum to the remotest period of time. With most touching detail, he promptly ordered the ship's officers to their stations, distributed the doctors into positions of the greatest usefulness, prepared comforts for man and mother and babe with foresight and tenderness. He lifted them from their watery imprisonment, and when the rescue had been completed, summoned all of the rescued together and ordered the ship's bell tolled for the lost, and asked that prayers of thankfulness be offered for those who had been spared. It falls to the lot of few men to perform a service so unselfish, and the American Congress can honor itself no more by a single act than by writing into its laws the gratitude we feel toward this modest and kindly man. The lessons of this hour are indeed fruitless and its precepts ill-conceived if rules of action do not follow hard upon the day of reckoning. Obsolete and antiquated shipping laws should no longer encumber the parliamentary records of any government, and overripe administrative boards should be pruned of dead branches and less sterile precepts taught and applied. End of Sinking of the Titanic, Most Appalling Ocean Horror, by Jay Henry Mowbray.